Hello and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Imagine a world where rivers run uphill, not in defiance of gravity, but in defiance of expectation, where water flowing south carries wealth flowing north, where downstream means upstream in fortune, where the current itself becomes a highway, connecting frozen forests to golden domes, Viking longships to Byzantine galleys, amber beads to silk robes. By all logic, the great river systems of Eastern Europe should have remained the domain of scattered tribes and subsistence fishermen, channels leading nowhere of consequence. And yet, for more than 3 centuries, these waterways sustained one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated civilizations, a realm that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from Slavic villages to cosmopolitan trading cities that rivaled Constantinople itself. Tonight, we will trace the unlikely rise of Kievan Rus, a civilization born from an impossible marriage of Norse warriors and Slavic farmers, pagan tradition and Byzantine Christianity, merchant pragmatism and princely ambition. We will witness how a collection of river towns became an empire, how Viking raiders became Orthodox princes, how the decision of one man to be baptized transformed the religious landscape of Eastern Europe forever. We will walk the streets of Kiev in its golden age, stand on its walls in its final hours, and ask what happens when a civilization built on flowing water confronts the whirlwind from the east. Before we get started, I'd really appreciate your like and subscription if you enjoy what you see here. It's the primary way I know to keep creating. Thank you so much for that support. I also find it fascinating to connect with viewers worldwide, so please drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and your local time. As the present fades to whispers, we find ourselves transported to the 9th century AD, to a world of endless forests and serpentine rivers, where the creak of oarlocks echoes across morning mist and the scent of pine mingles with the salt spray of distant seas. The dream begins with water, always with water, in the 9th century AD, as Charlemagne's empire fractures and Viking longships probe the coasts of Europe, a different kind of journey unfolds in the east. Here, in the vast forests and marshlands between the Baltic and the Black Seas, nature has carved a puzzle of interconnected waterways: the Dnieper, the Volga, the Dvina, the Don. Rivers that rise within portage distance of each other, rivers that flow to different seas, rivers that, if you know their secrets, can carry you from the frozen north to the warm harbours of the Mediterranean, from Scandinavia to the gates of Constantinople. Picture these routes in your mind. A merchant stands at the edge of Lake Ilmen, north of what will become Novgorod. Before him lies a journey of thousands of miles, much of it navigable by boat. He will pole his vessel up the Lovat River, portage across a stretch of muddy woodland, launch again into the western Dvina, portage once more to the Dnieper. Then, for weeks, he will drift southward, past endless banks of forest, past the lands of a dozen Slavic tribes, past the churning rapids that will give their name to the entire route. Finally, if he survives the waterfalls, the bandits, and the steppe raiders, he will emerge into the Black Sea, the ancient Pontus Euxinus, and there before him will rise the great walls of Constantinople, the queen of cities, the beating heart of the Christian world. This was not merely travel, this was alchemy. Furs and honey and beeswax from the northern forests transformed into Byzantine gold. Amber from the Baltic shores exchanged for steel and spices from the east. Slaves, captured in endless forest wars, sold in Mediterranean markets. And along these routes, in the places where rivers narrowed or rapids forced portage, in the spots where different waterways came close enough to drag boats between them, towns began to appear. Trading posts, forts, the seeds of cities. The dream was of wealth beyond measure, flowing like the rivers themselves, rivers of amber and silver. The Eastern trade was older than memory. Long before the Rus princes built their wooden halls in Kiev, merchants had followed these waterways. The ancient Greeks knew of the Scythians who controlled the steppe. The Romans received amber from the mysterious north, though they knew little of how it travelled to them. But in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, the system crystallized into something more organized, more profitable, more dangerous. 2 great routes dominated this commerce. The first, older and more eastern, followed the Volga River south to the Caspian Sea, then overland to the Arab caliphates of Central Asia and Persia. This was the route to silver, for the Islamic world minted coins by the millions, and these dirhams became the common currency of the north. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia and Russia reveal hordes of tens of thousands of these Arabic coins, buried by their owners and never reclaimed, silent testimony to violent times and sudden deaths. The second route, the one that would matter more to our story, ran down the Dnieper to the Black Sea and thence to Constantinople. This was the route the Byzantines called from the Varangians to the Greeks, the highway that connected the Norse peoples of Scandinavia and their eastern settlements to the greatest city in Christendom. It was more dangerous than the Volga route. The Dnieper cuts through the open steppe, through the lands of nomadic peoples who knew well how to raid slow-moving boats. But the rewards were greater. Byzantium had what the north craved beyond even silver: steel that held an edge, silk that shimmered like water, wine that banished the darkness of winter, and the prestige of dealing with an empire that traced its lineage to Rome itself. Imagine the cargoes moving along these routes. From the north came furs, mink and marten and sable, the soft pelts that kept Byzantine nobility warm in their marble palaces. Honey arrived in sealed jars, sweetness from the endless forests, beeswax by the ton, for the candles that lit Orthodox churches, walrus ivory from the distant Arctic, and slaves, always slaves, captives from tribal wars, a commodity that shames us now, but enriched those who transported them then. In return, the northern traders received the products of civilization, Byzantine silks and brocades, woven with techniques the north could not replicate, steel blades forged in Damascus or Toledo, superior to anything a Norse smith could produce, glass beads and jewelry, spices from India and beyond, wine from Greek islands, religious artifacts, icons, and crosses, reliquaries containing the bones of saints, and always, flowing both directions, silver and gold, the universal languages of value. But commerce alone does not build civilizations. Trade requires infrastructure. Someone must control the portages, guard the trading posts, negotiate with the steppe nomads who could destroy a merchant caravan with ease. Someone must maintain order along hundreds of miles of river, prevent tribal chiefs from demanding excessive tolls, punish bandits who attack boats. Someone must do what merchants cannot do for themselves. Enter the warriors. Enter the Varangians. Enter those who would become known as the Rus. The archaeology tells a story the chronicles only hint at. At Gnezdovo, near what would become Smolensk, excavators have found burial mounds containing both Scandinavian and Slavic grave goods, Norse weapons alongside Slavic pottery, boat burials in the northern tradition next to simpler Slavic graves. The dead speak of a meeting, a mixing, a synthesis that the written sources barely acknowledge. These were not simple raids or brief trading visits. These were settlements, communities where Norse and Slav lived side by side, where a warrior from Uppsala might take a Slavic wife, where a Slavic chief might adopt Norse burial customs. The rivers demanded cooperation. A single person could not navigate the Dnieper rapids alone. A lone merchant could not defend his cargo from steppe raiders. Survival required community, and community required some form of government, some acknowledged leader who could make decisions that bound everyone. The rivers, in their flowing inevitability, created the conditions for state formation. And in the north, in the lands around Lake Ladoga and Lake Ilmen, in the forests where Slavic tribes had lived for centuries, a question was forming. A question about power, about order, about who should rule and why. A question whose answer would change everything. The invitation that changed a continent. Here we encounter one of history's great puzzles. A story so convenient for later rulers that we must suspect it, yet so persistent in the sources that we cannot entirely dismiss it. The Primary Chronicle, written more than 2 centuries after the events it describes, tells us that in the year 862 AD, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north were at war with each other. The faction against faction, town against town, a chaos without resolution, and in their desperation, the chronicle claims, they made an extraordinary decision. They invited foreigners to rule them. "Our land is great and rich," the chronicle records them saying, "but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us." The invitation went to the Varangians, the Norse peoples across the Baltic, to men who were simultaneously traders and raiders, explorers and conquerors, builders and destroyers. And one of their leaders, a man named Rurik, accepted. He came with his brothers and his followers and established himself at Novgorod, or perhaps at nearby Ladoga. The sources differ. His brothers died within a few years. Rurik alone remained, the foreign ruler of a willing people, the founder of a dynasty that would rule for more than 700 years. Every historian who encounters this story must reckon with its implications. Did it really happen this way? Did tribes genuinely invite conquest? Or is this a later invention, a mythical justification created by Rurik's descendants to legitimize their power? The debate has consumed scholars for generations. Some see it as pure fabrication. Others find in it a kernel of historical truth, arguing that inviting a foreign arbiter was a common solution to intractable civil conflicts in early medieval societies. The Irish did it. The Picts did it. Why not the Slavs and Finns of the north? The archaeology offers tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. Scandinavian presence in the region is undeniable. The artifacts prove it. Boat burials, oval brooches, Thor's hammer amulets, runic inscriptions. But presence does not prove conquest, and conquest does not prove invitation. What we can say with certainty is this. By the second half of the 9th century AD, a Scandinavian, or partly Scandinavian elite had established itself in the northern river systems. Whether they came as invited rulers, as conquerors, or as merchants who gradually accumulated power, the result was the same. A new political order was emerging. The word Rus itself is disputed. Some scholars derive it from the Finnish word for Swedes, ruotsi, suggesting a Scandinavian origin. Others connect it to rowing or seafaring, to the physical act of moving along the rivers. Still others find Slavic roots. Like everything else about these early years, the very name carries multiple meanings, multiple possible pasts. What we know is that Rurik's arrival, whether by invitation or conquest, whether in 862 AD or some other year, marks a turning point in the chronicles. Before him, scattered tribes and trading posts. After him, the beginning of state formation. He appears in the sources almost as a ghost, leaving little mark beyond his name and his supposed arrival. He dies within 17 years, in 879 AD, leaving a young son named Igor, and he leaves something else. A kinsman named Oleg, who serves as regent for the child Igor. Oleg, who the later chronicles will call the prophet. Oleg, who has no interest in ruling merely Novgorod and the northern forests. Oleg, whose eyes are fixed southward, down the great river highway, toward the city that controls the middle Dnieper, the city that sits at the crossroads of all the trade routes, the city whose capture would change everything. Oleg's gambit, the mother of cities. The year is 882 AD. Oleg, regent for the young Igor, has made his decision. Novgorod alone is insufficient. The northern rivers are frozen half the year. The route to the Caspian, the Volga pathway, is dominated by the Khazars, a powerful steppe empire that controls the eastern approaches. The way south, down the Dnieper to Byzantium, passes through territories beyond Oleg's control. Controlling the northern terminus of the trade route is not enough. He must control the southern terminus as well, must hold both ends of the highway to truly dominate the commerce. Kiev stands on the western bank of the Dnieper, on a series of hills rising above the river's floodplain. It commands the middle section of the route to Constantinople. More importantly, it sits just north of the Dnieper Rapids, the series of waterfalls and cataracts that force boats to portage, that create natural choke points where tolls can be collected and merchants made dependent on local protection. Whoever controls Kiev controls the wealthiest section of the entire trade network. The city is not Oleg's. It belongs to two Varangians named Askold and Dir, who may have been former companions of Rurik, who struck out on their own, or may have been independent adventurers who seized the place before Rurik's time. The chronicles are unclear and contradictory, as they so often are for this period. What matters is that they hold Kiev, and Oleg wants it. The Primary Chronicle gives us a story. Oleg travels south with a force of warriors, bringing the young Igor with him. But he does not approach Kiev as a conqueror. He hides his warriors in boats, pretends to be a simple merchant passing through. He sends word to Askold and Dir that fellow Varangians wish to meet them, to discuss trade perhaps, to pay respects. And when the two rulers of Kiev come down to the riverbank, Oleg springs his trap. "You are not of princely blood," Oleg declares, producing the child Igor. "Here is the son of Rurik, the true prince." And then Askold and Dir are killed, murdered on the shore, and Oleg takes Kiev without a battle, through deception and ruthless efficiency. How much of this is true? We cannot know. The tale serves Oleg's later dynasty well, establishing a clear line of succession from Rurik through Igor, legitimizing the conquest as a restoration of rightful authority rather than mere seizure. But whether by guile or by force, whether exactly in 882 AD or somewhat earlier or later, Oleg did take Kiev. This much the sources agree upon, and upon taking it, he is said to have proclaimed, "Let this be the mother of Russian cities." The phrase resonates through the centuries. Mother of cities, Mother of Rus. Kiev would hold this title for more than 350 years, would become a place spoken of in the same breath as Constantinople and Cordoba, a city of hundreds of churches and tens of thousands of inhabitants, a gleaming jewel on the Dnieper. But in 882 AD, it was simpler, smaller, a wooden fort and trading settlement on strategic hills. Oleg's genius was not in what Kiev was, but in what it could become. Within a few years, Oleg had extended his authority over the Slavic tribes along the Dnieper Valley, the Derevlians in the forests to the west, the Severians to the east, the Radomichi and Vietici further afield. Some submitted peacefully, seeing advantage in protection and access to trade. Others required conquest. The chronicles record campaigns and tribute payments, the extension of something that begins to resemble a state. But Oleg's ambition did not stop at Kiev's hinterland. He controlled now the entire river highway from Novgorod to Kiev, from the Baltic approaches to the steppe borderlands. But the highway ended at Constantinople, and Constantinople was the richest prize of all. Not to conquer, that would be impossible, but to force recognition, to compel favourable trading terms, to make the Byzantine Empire acknowledge the Rus as equals rather than barbarians. This became Oleg's obsession. In 907 AD, if the chronicles are to be believed, he assembled a fleet of 2,000 boats and sailed down the Dnieper, through the rapids, across the Black Sea, to the very walls of the Queen of Cities. Between three worlds, you stand on the wooden pier at Kiev in the spring of the year 900 AD, and you have never seen anything like this in your life. You are a merchant, perhaps, or an artisan, or maybe just a curious youth watching the world flow past. The air smells of river water and pine sap, of cooking fires and horses, of fish and leather and human sweat. The morning sun glints off the Dnieper's current, making the water shine like hammered bronze. To your left, a group of Varangian warriors prepares a longship for departure. You hear them speaking in their Norse tongue, harsh consonants and rolling sounds that your Slavic ear struggles to pass. They are tall men, most of them, with long hair and longer beards, wearing tunics and trousers in the northern style. Their weapons are everywhere, swords and axes, spears and round shields painted in bright colours. One of them laughs at something, a booming sound that carries across the water. You notice the silver arm rings they wear, marks of status and wealth, glinting in the sunlight. To your right, a Byzantine merchant argues about prices with a local trader. The Byzantine speaks Greek, rapid and fluid, his hands moving in elaborate gestures. He wears a long robe of fine wool, dyed a deep red that speaks of expense and taste. His companion, a servant or perhaps a slave, stands behind him holding a bundle of silk cloth, the fabric catching the light in ways that make it seem almost alive, shifting colours as it moves. The local trader responds in a heavily accented Greek. Or perhaps they are both speaking some trade pidgin, a simplified tongue that serves for commerce even when true understanding is impossible. You smell bread baking somewhere nearby, the yeasty aroma mixing with wood smoke. Someone is cooking fish, probably fresh from the river, and the scent makes your stomach rumble. From one of the larger halls on the hill above, you hear music, a stringed instrument of some kind, playing a melody you half recognize. A group of Khazar merchants passes you, distinctive in their dress and their carefully groomed beards. They lead pack horses laden with goods from the east, and you catch glimpses of glassware and carved ivory, of small boxes that might contain spices or medicines. One of them nods to you politely, a stranger acknowledging a stranger in a strange city. A woman walks by, carrying a basket of eggs, speaking Slavic in an accent different from yours. She might be Polanian, from the local tribe, or Derevlian from the forests, or Severian from the east. The Slavic world is vast, and Kiev draws people from all its corners. She wears a simple dress and a headscarf, practical clothing for practical work. But you notice bronze bracelets on her wrists, a small sign of prosperity. The sounds wash over you in waves. Hammering from somewhere, a blacksmith at work, chickens clucking, a dog barking, men shouting to each other as they load a boat, coordinating their movements. A child crying, quickly comforted. Church bells, bronze and echoing, calling the faithful to prayer. For there are Christians here already, Byzantine merchants, and perhaps a few converted locals, though most people still honour the old gods. You look up at the hill where Oleg's hall stands, a large wooden structure that dominates the skyline. Smoke rises from its roof. Guards stand at its entrance, armed men who watch everyone who passes. This is the centre of power, the heart from which Oleg's will radiates outward. From here, he rules the Slavic tribes, negotiates with the steppe peoples, sends embassies to Constantinople. From here, he controls the river route that has made Kiev wealthy. You have heard stories that Oleg is a sorcerer, gifted with prophecy, protected by spirits, that he once laid siege to Constantinople itself and forced the emperor to pay tribute, that he is ruthless to enemies but generous to friends, that he speaks 5 languages and understands 10. You do not know which stories are true, but you know this. Kiev grows wealthier every year. More boats arrive, more merchants settle, more churches and halls rise on the hills. Whatever Oleg is doing, it is working. A gust of wind brings the scent of distant steppe, grass and horses, and vast empty spaces. Somewhere out there, beyond the city's immediate surroundings, nomadic peoples watch these river towns with interest and appetite. The Pechenegs, the Magyars, others whose names you do not know, they raid sometimes, demand tribute, trade when it suits them. The steppe is another world, a fourth world perhaps, beyond the Norse and Slavic and Byzantine realms that meet here in Kiev. But for now, in this moment, you stand at a crossroads. 3 worlds converge in this wooden city on the Dnieper, and you are witness to their meeting. The shield on the gate. The chronicles stretch the truth here, almost certainly. They transform Oleg from a clever warlord into a figure of legend, from a political opportunist into a hero from saga. But legends have power, and the story of Oleg's campaign against Constantinople in 907 AD became one of the defining myths of early Rus identity. Picture, if you can, 2,000 boats moving down the Dnieper. The chronicle's number is surely exaggerated. Even a few hundred boats would represent an enormous military undertaking. But whether 2,000 or 200, Oleg assembled a fleet and sailed against the greatest city in the Christian world, against walls that had broken siege after siege for nearly 1,000 years, against an empire that still thought of itself as Rome. The Byzantines, according to the story, saw the Rus fleet approaching and closed the harbour with chains, an ancient defence that prevented ships from entering the Golden Horn. Oleg, undeterred, ordered his men to place wheels under their boats. When the wind was favourable, they raised sails and rolled the ships across dry land, around the harbour defences, appearing where they should not be, violating every expectation of how naval warfare ought to function. Is this true? Almost certainly not, at least not literally. Ships with wheels rolling across land makes for magnificent storytelling but questionable history. Yet, something happened. Some combination of raiding and threatening, of demonstrating force and willingness to use it, convinced the Byzantine emperor to negotiate. A treaty was signed in 911 AD, a formal agreement between the Empire of the Romans and these northern warriors who called themselves Rus. The treaty survives, at least in summary form, copied into the chronicles. Its provisions tell us much about what Oleg wanted. Rus merchants were to be allowed to trade in Constantinople, free of tariffs, a privilege normally reserved only for the most favoured nations. They were to receive provisions while in the city, including bread, wine, meat, and fish. They were to have access to bathhouses, an important amenity that speaks to the length of their stays. When they returned north, they were to receive supplies for their journey, including sails and rigging for their ships. In return, the Rus agreed to enter Constantinople only through a specific gate, no more than 50 at a time, unarmed and escorted by imperial officials. They agreed not to winter in the city, not to purchase more than 50 gold pieces worth of silk, and to assist any Byzantine ships they found wrecked or endangered. The treaty establishes rules, boundaries, expectations. It is a remarkably detailed document for its time, suggesting prolonged negotiation and genuine diplomatic sophistication on both sides. But the chronicles want more than diplomatic history. They want glory. They want an image that will endure. And so they give us Oleg nailing his shield to the gate of Constantinople, a gesture of triumph, a visible sign that the Rus had touched the greatest city in the world and made it acknowledge their power. Whether Oleg literally nailed a shield to a gate is less important than what the image represents. The Rus were no longer mere raiders or peripheral merchants. They had forced the Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome, keeper of Orthodox Christianity, most sophisticated state in Europe, to sign a treaty with them as equals. They had gained privileges that put them on par with established kingdoms. They had, in their own eyes, and in the eyes of those who would come after them, arrived on the stage of history. Oleg returned to Kiev, laden with gold and silk and glory. The treaty secured for his merchants a favourable position in the most lucrative trade network in the known world. Byzantine goods would flow north in greater quantities. Rus wealth would increase accordingly. The Treaty of 911 AD was perhaps Oleg's greatest achievement, more significant than his conquest of Kiev, for it established the Rus not merely as regional powers, but as participants in the broader Mediterranean world. The chronicles say he ruled Kiev for 33 years, from 882 to 912 AD. They call him Oleg the Prophet, Oleg the Wise, though they do not explain the source of his prophetic gifts. They say he died from a snake bite, bitten by a serpent that emerged from the skull of his dead horse, a death that has the ring of folk tale rather than fact. But death comes for all, even for those who nail shields to the gates of Constantinople. He left Kiev, transformed. What had been a regional trading post was now the capital of an emerging state. What had been scattered tribes under loose confederation was now something approaching a realm. The infrastructure was in place, the trade routes secured, the relationship with Byzantium established. Everything was ready for the next chapter, for the expansion and consolidation that would build on Oleg's foundation. But first, his successors would learn that dealing with Byzantium required more than shields on gates. It required understanding the full measure of Byzantine power, including the secret weapons that guarded the Queen of Cities. Fire on the water. Igor, son of Rurik, for whom Oleg had served as regent, took power upon Oleg's death in 912 AD. The chronicles paint him as less impressive than his predecessor, more prone to mistakes, more driven by greed than wisdom. Whether this is fair assessment or later bias, we cannot know. What we can say is that Igor made one catastrophic error that the sources record in vivid detail. In 941 AD, 3 decades into his reign, Igor assembled a fleet and sailed against Constantinople. Perhaps he hoped to repeat Oleg's triumph, to win tribute and favourable treaties through show of force. Perhaps he thought the Byzantines had grown weak or careless. Perhaps he simply underestimated them. Whatever his reasoning, he brought his ships across the Black Sea and appeared before the city walls, ready to demonstrate Rus' power just as Oleg had done. The Byzantines had a surprise waiting for him. The sources call it Greek fire, a name that tells us almost nothing. The Byzantines themselves called it sea fire, or Roman fire, or simply the prepared fire. Its exact composition remains one of history's lost secrets, but its effects were unmistakable. Housed in bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine ships, projected through siphons under pressure, the substance burst into flames when it contacted air and water. It burned on the surface of the sea. It burned on wet wood. It could not be extinguished by normal means. Pouring water on it only spread the flames. Imagine you are on one of Igor's ships. You see the Byzantine galleys approaching, sleeker and faster than your vessel, crewed by men who have trained their entire lives for naval warfare. You have fought before, have boarded merchant ships and raided coastal towns. You know how ship combat works. You ready your weapons, prepare to close and fight hand to hand. Then you see the tubes swivel toward you. You hear a whooshing sound, almost like a great beast exhaling, and then the world becomes fire. Liquid flame arcs through the air, landing on your ship's deck, on the sail, on the water around you. Everywhere it touches, it ignites. Men scream and throw themselves into the sea, only to find the water itself burning, flames spreading across the waves in patterns that defy nature. The heat is overwhelming. The smoke chokes you. The fire spreads faster than you can react. Your ship is doomed. You dive into the water, hoping to escape the flames. But the fire follows you. You swim desperately, lungs burning, knowing that if you surface near the burning patches you will die. Some of your companions do not make it. You hear their screams cut short. The Byzantine historian Theophanes Continuatus recorded the aftermath. The Rus, seeing the flames, threw themselves from their ships, preferring to drown rather than burn. Some, weighed down by their armour and the weight of their clothing, sank immediately. Others struggled in the water and were consumed by flames. Igor's fleet was destroyed. The sources claim 15 ships escaped out of hundreds. Whether the numbers are accurate hardly matters. What matters is that Igor limped back to Kiev, humiliated, his warriors dead or scattered, his ambitions in ruins. The Byzantines had demonstrated that their empire was not defenseless, that their ancient wisdom included weapons the Rus could not match, that some walls should not be tested. But Igor was nothing if not persistent, or perhaps merely stubborn. In 944 AD, 3 years after the disaster, he tried again. This time he approached more carefully, assembled a larger force, coordinated with Pecheneг allies from the steppe, and this time, the Byzantine emperor decided that negotiation was preferable to another war. Envoys met Igor before he reached Constantinople. Terms were discussed. A new treaty was signed. The 944 AD treaty was less favourable than Oleg's had been. The Rus merchants still received trading privileges, but the terms were more restrictive. The tariff exemption was reduced. The provisions were less generous. Igor had to agree to defend Byzantine interests in Crimea, to prevent other Rus forces from raiding Byzantine territories. The treaty recognised Rus' existence and Rus trade, but it established Byzantine superiority clearly. Igor accepted. Perhaps he had learned the lesson of Greek fire. Perhaps he simply recognised reality. Either way, he returned to Kiev with a treaty that secured Rus commercial interests while acknowledging Byzantine military supremacy. It was not the triumph Oleg had won, but it was better than annihilation. The Greek fire would remain in Byzantine hands for centuries, its secret closely guarded, its formula known only to a select few. Long after the Byzantine Empire itself fell, people would still speak in hushed tones about the fire that burned on water, the weapon that made Constantinople impregnable from the sea. Igor had paid the price of that lesson in ships and lives. But he was not done paying. His next mistake would cost him his life. The question of gods? Before we continue with Igor's fate, we must step back and consider the religious landscape of 9th and 10th century Rus. This is essential context, for the gods people worship shape the civilizations they build, and the choice between gods would eventually define Kievan Rus more than any political or military achievement. The Slavic peoples of the forests and rivers had their own deities, their own sacred traditions, older than written record. Perun was chief among them, god of thunder and war, often depicted with a silver head and golden beard, associated with the oak tree in the high places. When lightning struck, people said Perun had cast his bolt. When thunder rolled, Perun was driving his chariot across the sky. Princes swore oaths by Perun. Warriors invoked his name before battle. He was power and storm, masculine and terrible. Exactly the god a warrior society would place at the centre of their pantheon, but Perun was not alone. Veles, god of cattle and commerce, of the earth and underworld, was Perun's opposite and enemy. Their eternal conflict supposedly drove the cycle of seasons and the patterns of weather. Dazbog was the sun god, giver of warmth and light. Stribog ruled the winds. Mokosh was the earth mother, protector of women and weaving, associated with fertility and harvest. The sources mention others, though details are scarce. Simargl, Kors, Svarog, the precise relationships and attributes blur in the mist of limited documentation. Worship occurred in sacred groves and at wooden idols. Priests existed, though their authority seems to have been less centralized than in some other pagan systems. Sacrifice was common, including animal sacrifice and, if the Christian sources are to be believed, occasional human sacrifice. Whether the latter was actually practiced, or simply Christian propaganda against paganism, we cannot be certain. The Christian sources had every reason to portray pre-Christian Rus as savage and in need of salvation. But the Rus territories were not religiously homogeneous. The rivers brought other faiths. Byzantine merchants brought Orthodox Christianity, worshipping in Greek Rite churches in Kiev and other trading cities. There were Christians among the Rus as early as the mid-9th century AD. The Treaty of 944 AD mentions Christian Rus swearing by their god and their crosses, suggesting a significant minority had already converted. To the east and south, the Khazar Khaganate presented something unique. The Khazar ruling class had converted to Judaism in the 8th century AD, creating a Jewish empire on the Eurasian steppe. Khazar influence extended into Rus territories, especially along the Volga route. Jewish traders were not uncommon in the river towns. Further south and east, Islam spread through Central Asia and into the Volga region. The Volga Bulgars had converted to Islam in the early 10th century AD. Muslim merchants travelled the river routes, bringing their faith along with their goods. And from Scandinavia came the Norse gods. Thor and Odin, Freya and Tyr, the whole pantheon of Asgard. The Varangians who settled among the Slavs brought these beliefs with them. Over time, the gods merged and mixed. Perun and Thor shared attributes. Some scholars argue they became effectively the same deity in Rus lands, worshipped under different names by different peoples, but recognized as similar enough to serve both populations. This religious diversity was not necessarily a source of conflict in the early years. Paganism of the Slavic and Norse varieties was generally tolerant of other beliefs. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were each present, but not dominant. People worshipped their gods, respected the gods of others, and focused on the practical matters of trade and survival. But religious tolerance carried political costs. The Byzantine Empire was Orthodox Christian and viewed pagan rulers with suspicion. Trade with Byzantium was essential to Rus' prosperity, but religious difference created diplomatic friction. How could a pagan prince marry a Byzantine princess? How could truly equal treaties be signed between a Christian empire and pagan warriors? Moreover, as Rus' power grew, as Kiev became a true capital rather than merely a trading post, the question of official religion became more pressing. Great states had state religions. Kingdoms had official faiths that bound ruler and ruled together, that provided divine sanction for earthly authority. The Khazars had Judaism. The Byzantines had Christianity. The Arabs had Islam. What would the Rus have? This question would simmer through the reigns of Oleg and Igor. It would become critical under Igor's widow, Olga, who made her own choice and tried unsuccessfully to convert her son. And it would finally be answered under Olga's grandson, Vladimir, whose decision would alter the religious map of Eastern Europe forever. But first, Olga herself must enter our story, and she enters it through violence and cunning, through the death of her husband and the revenge she took for it. A widow's cunning. Igor, having survived Greek fire and Byzantine treaties, died at the hands of people he thought subdued. The Derevlians, a Slavic tribe living in the forests west of Kiev, had long paid tribute to the Rus princes. In 945 AD, Igor decided their tribute was insufficient. He visited their lands, collected what was owed, and left. Then, whether from greed or miscalculation or simple arrogance, he turned back with a small retinue, intending to extract more. The Derevlians had endured enough. Prince Mal, their leader, saw an opportunity. Igor was vulnerable, separated from his main force, surrounded by only a small guard. The Derevlians attacked. Igor was captured. The sources say he was tied between two bent trees, which were then released, tearing him apart. Whether this gruesome detail is historical or embellishment, the result was certain. Igor was dead, and the Kievan Rus had a crisis of succession. Igor's son, Sviatoslav, was only a child, perhaps 3 years old. Regency fell to Igor's widow, Olga, and Olga, the sources make clear, was a woman not to be underestimated. The Derevlians, having killed the Rus prince, faced a choice. They could expect retaliation, or they could try to turn the situation to their advantage. Prince Mal chose the latter. He sent envoys to Kiev with an extraordinary proposal. Olga should marry him. By marrying the Derevlian prince, she would bring Kiev and the Derevlian lands into a peaceful union. Mal would become the stepfather to young Sviatoslav and effectively ruler of the Rus. The 20 envoys arrived in Kiev by boat, proud and confident, bearing their prince's proposal. Olga received them with courtesy, asked them to repeat their message before the whole court the next day, and sent them back to their boat for the night. That night, she ordered her men to dig a deep pit in the courtyard. The next morning, Olga had the envoys carried to the court in their boat, an honor that pleased them. As they approached, she gestured. The men carrying the boat pivoted and dumped the entire party, boat and all, into the pit. Olga walked to the edge and looked down at them. "Is this honor to your taste?" she asked. Then she ordered the pit filled with earth, burying the envoys alive. She was not finished. Olga sent word to the Derevlians that she accepted the proposal, but required the most distinguished men of the tribe to escort her to the wedding, for she could not come without proper honor. The Derevlians, apparently unaware of their envoy's fate, sent their best men. When these new envoys arrived, Olga offered them the hospitality of a bathhouse, for they were tired from their journey and should refresh themselves before meeting with her. The Derevlians entered the bathhouse gratefully. Olga had the doors barred from the outside and the building set on fire. All burned to death. Now, the chronicler tells us, Olga sent another message to the Derevlians. She would indeed come to their lands to mourn her husband properly at his grave, but she wished to hold a funeral feast. Would they prepare mead for the occasion? The Derevlians, still somehow trusting or simply confused, agreed. Olga travelled to Derevlian territory with a small retinue. A great funeral feast was prepared. The Derevlians drank the mead freely. When they were drunk, Olga's retinue drew their weapons and slaughtered 5,000 of them, according to the Chronicle. The number is surely inflated, but the massacre was real. Even this did not satisfy her. The following year, 946 AD, Olga returned with an army. She besieged the Derevlian capital, Iskorostan. The city held out, protected by wooden walls, and the determination of people who now understood they faced annihilation. Months passed. The siege dragged on. Then Olga sent word that she would accept a token tribute and leave. She asked for 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. A simple request, almost humiliating in its modesty. The Derevlians, desperate and hopeful, agreed readily. Olga's soldiers tied small pieces of sulphur wrapped in cloth to the feet of the birds. At night, they lit the cloth and released the birds. The pigeons and sparrows flew home to their nests in the thatched roofs and wooden eaves of Iskorostan. The city burned. As people fled the flames, Olga's forces captured them. Some were enslaved, some were killed, some were allowed to live, but forced to pay heavy tribute forever after. The chronicler, who recorded these events, writing from a Christian perspective, more than a century later, saw in Olga both ruthlessness and wisdom, both cruelty and justice. She had avenged her husband with a thoroughness that ensured no one would challenge her regency. She had protected her son's inheritance. She had demonstrated that a woman could rule as effectively and as terribly as any man. And then, perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, Olga turned her attention to religion. Around 957 AD, she travelled to Constantinople and received baptism, taking the Christian name Helena. The Byzantine emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus, himself supposedly stood as her godfather. She returned to Kiev as the first Christian ruler of the Rus. She could not convert her people. That would require a man with different circumstances and different motives. Her son, Sviatoslav, when he grew to rule in his own name, remained fiercely pagan, mocking his mother's new faith. But Olga had planted a seed. She had shown that conversion was possible. She had established a connection between the Rus elite and the Byzantine church. 30 years later, her grandson Vladimir would harvest what she had sown. But that transformation still lay ahead. On the other side of Sviatoslav's brief, violent reign, on the far side of decisions not yet made, the bastard prince, Sviatoslav, Olga's son, grew to manhood with a sword in his hand and contempt for luxury. The chronicles paint him as a warrior prince in the old pagan mould, a man who slept on the ground with his saddle for a pillow, who ate horse meat roasted over campfires, who disdained the comforts of palace life. He spent most of his reign fighting eastward against the Khazars, destroying their power along the Volga, southward against the Bulgars on the Danube, dreaming of moving his capital away from Kiev to the strategic fortress of Pereyaslavice, closer to Byzantium, closer to the action. His mother's Christianity meant nothing to him. When Olga urged him to convert, he refused flatly. "How can I alone change my faith?" he reportedly said. "My warriors will laugh at me." Whether this reflects genuine religious conviction or political calculation, the result was the same. Rus remained pagan under Sviatoslav's rule. He died in 972 AD, ambushed by Pecheneg nomads at the Dnieper Rapids while returning from his Balkan campaigns. The Pecheneg Khan courier had his skull made into a drinking cup, a grim honour sometimes accorded to worthy enemies. Sviatoslav left 3 sons, and no clear succession plan, ensuring civil war. The youngest son was Vladimir. His mother was Malusha, a housekeeper in Olga's court, possibly a former slave, possibly even a daughter of Prince Mal of the Derevlians, though sources differ. Vladimir was thus a bastard, born of a union that gave him no legitimate claim to power. His older half-brothers, Yaropolk and Oleg, were born to more prestigious mothers. By all logic of medieval succession, Vladimir should have remained a minor prince, given some small territory to rule, kept away from real power. But logic and ambition rarely travel the same path. When civil war erupted between the brothers, Vladimir fled to Scandinavia, gathering Varangian warriors who cared nothing for legitimacy and everything for plunder and payment. He returned with an army. Oleg died in the fighting, possibly accidentally, possibly not. Yaropolk tried to resist but was betrayed and murdered. By 980 AD, Vladimir stood as sole ruler of Kiev, having waded through his brother's blood to claim the throne. His paganism was fierce and public. He erected a great pantheon of idols on the hill above Kiev, Perun in pride of place, with a silver head and golden moustache. Kors and Dazbog, Strybog and Simagl, Mokosh, the gods of the Slavs, and some borrowed from elsewhere, a public declaration that the Rus would remain true to the old ways. Sacrifices were offered, possibly including human victims, though the Christian sources that report this may be exaggerating for rhetorical effect. Vladimir took multiple wives, accumulating a harem that the later chroniclers would describe with simultaneous condemnation and fascination. 800 concubines, the Primary Chronicle claims. Surely an exaggeration, but indicative of his reputation for appetites. He raided and conquered. He took Polotsk by force and married the prince's daughter Rogneda after killing her father and brothers, a union that began with violence and would produce several of his most important sons. For the first years of his reign, Vladimir appeared to be exactly what circumstances had made him. A pagan warlord who had seized power through force and held it through fear. He expanded Rus territory. He fought the Pechenegs on the steppe frontier. He built a network of fortifications to protect the southern approaches to Kiev. He was effective, ruthless, successful by the measures of his time. But something changed. Sometime in the late 980s AD, Vladimir began to question. Perhaps he had visited Constantinople and seen the wealth that Christianity brought. Perhaps he recognized that remaining pagan isolated the Rus diplomatically. Perhaps he genuinely experienced spiritual doubt. The sources give us a story, dramatized and simplified, but containing some kernel of what must have been a complex process of consideration and calculation. Vladimir looked around his world and saw that the great powers all had the same thing, a monotheistic faith that bound ruler and ruled together under one god, one book, one structure of religious authority. The question was not whether to convert, but to what. The idols stood on the hill, the sacrifices continued, but Vladimir was thinking, and his thoughts would reshape a continent. The testing of faiths. The Primary Chronicle, written more than a century after these events, gives us one of history's most memorable scenes. Whether it happened exactly as described is less important than what it reveals about how later Rus understood their conversion. The story has the quality of legend, but legends crystallize truths that dry facts sometimes obscure. Vladimir, the Chronicle tells us, decided to investigate the major monotheistic faiths before choosing one. He sent envoys to observe each religion in practice, to report back on what they found. But first, he received embassies at Kiev, each making their case. The Volga Bulgars came first, Muslims who had converted in the early 10th century AD. They explained Islam to Vladimir, the 5 pillars, the devotion to Allah, the promise of paradise for the faithful. They spoke of prayer and fasting, of pilgrimage and charity. Vladimir listened with interest until they mentioned the prohibition on alcohol. "Drinking is the joy of the Rus," he reportedly said. "We cannot exist without that pleasure." Whether Vladimir actually said this, or whether the Christian chronicler invented it to explain why Rus rejected Islam, we cannot know. But the line has endured for 1,000 years, becoming almost proverbial. It may be propaganda, but it reflects a cultural truth. Wine and mead were central to Rus social life, to feasting and community, to the rituals that bound warriors together. A faith that forbade drinking seemed incompatible with Rus culture. Next came envoys from the Pope in Rome, representing Western Catholic Christianity. They made their case: the universality of the Church, the authority of Rome, the sophistication of Latin liturgy, but Vladimir had political reasons to be wary. The German kingdoms that bordered Rus territories were Catholic, and Vladimir had no interest in acknowledging religious authority that might translate into political pressure from the West. The sources suggest he dismissed them quickly, though perhaps more happened than the Chronicle records. Jewish envoys came from the Khazars, or perhaps from Khazarian territories. They explained Judaism, monotheism, the covenant, the Torah, the chosen people. Vladimir asked them a pointed question: "Where is your land?" "God was angry with our forefathers and scattered us among the nations," they replied, a reference to the diaspora and the destruction of the Second Temple. "If God loved you," Vladimir is said to have responded, "you would not be dispersed. Do you wish us to suffer the same fate?" The logic is brutal but revealing. Vladimir saw religion not merely as spiritual truth, but as political technology. A God who could not protect his people, who allowed them to be conquered and scattered, was not a God worth following. This was a practical consideration, not theological. Vladimir wanted a faith that conferred power, stability, legitimacy. Judaism, for all its ancient prestige, came with the baggage of displacement and powerlessness. Finally came the Byzantine Greeks, bringing Orthodox Christianity. Their presentation, according to the Chronicle, was different. They did not merely explain doctrine. They told stories. They spoke of creation and fall, of Christ and redemption, of judgment and resurrection. They painted in vivid images, describing heaven and hell, the rewards of the righteous and the punishment of the wicked. They showed Vladimir icons, visible representations of invisible truths, bringing theology into the realm of the senses. Vladimir listened but did not commit. Instead, he sent his own envoys to observe each faith in practice. The Chronicle names 10 good and wise men, though the number has the quality of literary convention rather than historical precision. They travelled first to the Bulgars, observing Muslim worship. They reported back that they saw no joy in it, only sorrow and a terrible smell. Whether this reflects genuine impressions or Christian prejudice, embedded in the later Chronicle, is impossible to determine. They travelled to the Germans and observed Catholic Mass. We saw no beauty there, they reported. Again, we must suspect bias. Western Christianity was sophisticated and elaborate in its own way, but the envoys were primed to prefer Byzantium. Then they came to Constantinople. They attended divine liturgy in Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, the greatest cathedral in Christendom. And here, the Chronicle gives us perhaps its most famous passage. We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, the envoys reported. For on earth there is no such splendour or such beauty, and we are at a loss how to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men, and their service is fairer than the ceremonies of other nations. We cannot forget that beauty. This is literature, carefully crafted by a Christian writer to explain why Rus chose orthodoxy. But beneath the rhetoric lies a truth. Byzantium, in the late 10th century AD, was magnificent beyond anything the Rus had experienced. Hagia Sophia was not merely a building but a theological argument made in marble and gold, in mosaics and incense, in liturgy sung by trained choirs. The building was designed to overwhelm, to manifest heaven on earth, to make the invisible visible. For Vladimir, the choice was becoming clear, but political calculation mattered as much as aesthetic impressions. Byzantium was the greatest Christian power. Alliance with Constantinople meant access to trade, to diplomatic prestige, to military technology. The Byzantine Empire had survived for more than 600 years since the fall of Rome in the West. Its god, apparently, knew how to protect his people. There was also the question of liturgy. The Western Church used Latin, a language foreign to the Slavs. But Orthodox missionaries had already created a Slavic liturgy. Saints Cyril and Methodius, a century earlier, had developed an alphabet for writing Slavic languages and had begun translating scripture and liturgical texts. This meant Rus could worship in their own tongue, could access sacred texts without learning Greek or Latin. The faith could become truly theirs, not merely an import from elsewhere. Vladimir's counsel, according to the Chronicle, reminded him of one final consideration. If the Greek faith were evil, it would not have been adopted by your grandmother Olga, who was wiser than all other men. Olga's conversion, decades earlier, had planted seeds that were now ready to harvest. She had shown it could be done, had established relationships with Constantinople, had perhaps even prepared the ground for her grandson's decision. Whether Vladimir felt genuine affection for his grandmother's memory, or simply recognized the political advantage of following her example, the result was the same. He chose Orthodox Christianity, but he would not simply accept baptism like any ordinary convert. He was a prince, a conqueror, the ruler of a powerful and growing state. If he was to become Christian, it would be on his terms, with honor and advantage. He would force the Byzantines to acknowledge his importance, to treat him as an equal. He would conquer a Byzantine city and demand an imperial bride, the siege of Cherson and the Purple Bourne. Cherson was a Byzantine city on the southern coast of Crimea, a prosperous port that controlled trade between the Black Sea and the interior. It was ancient, having been founded as a Greek colony in the 5th century BC, and it remained an important outpost of Byzantine power in the north. It was also vulnerable, far from Constantinople, dependent on sea communications that could be disrupted. In 988 AD, Vladimir assembled an army and sailed to Crimea. He laid siege to Cherson, surrounding it by land and blockading it by sea. The city held out, trusting in its walls and its Byzantine allegiance. Months passed. Winter came. The siege dragged on, with neither side gaining advantage. Then, according to the Chronicle, a man named Anastasius shot an arrow over the walls with a message attached. The message revealed where the city's water pipes ran, explaining that destroying them would force Cherson to surrender. Whether this betrayal actually happened, or whether Vladimir's forces simply discovered the pipes through reconnaissance, the result was certain. The water supply was cut. Cherson had no choice but to negotiate. Vladimir had won, but not through simple military prowess. He had taken a Byzantine city, something few barbarian princes had accomplished. He now had leverage, something to trade. He sent word to Constantinople, to the co-emperors Basil and Constantine, the brothers who ruled the Byzantine Empire. His message was simple: give me your sister Anna in marriage, or I will do to Constantinople what I have done to Cherson. The demand was outrageous. Anna Porphyrogenita, born in the purple chamber of the imperial palace, a princess of the blood, descended from Constantine the Great himself, from the Caesars of ancient Rome. Byzantine princesses did not marry barbarian kings. It was unthinkable, a violation of imperial dignity and tradition. But Basil and Constantine were practical men facing practical problems. They were embroiled in a dangerous civil war. A general named Bardas Phocas had rebelled and was marching on Constantinople with a substantial army. The emperors needed military help, and they needed it immediately. Vladimir had warriors, thousands of them, Varangians and Rus who could fight effectively if properly motivated. A bargain was struck. Vladimir would send 6,000 warriors to help defend Constantinople against the rebel. In return, he would receive Anna's hand in marriage. But there was one condition, non-negotiable. From the Byzantine perspective, Vladimir must convert to Christianity. No pagan could marry a Christian princess, especially not one born in the purple. Vladimir agreed. Whether he had planned this all along, or whether the timing was fortuitous coincidence, he had achieved exactly what he wanted. He would become Christian, but not as a supplicant begging for baptism. He would become Christian as an equal to emperors, as a conqueror who had forced Byzantium to acknowledge his power, as a husband to an imperial princess. Anna, for her part, had no choice in the matter. The sources suggest she wept at the news, that she compared her fate to slavery, that she went unwillingly to the barbarian north. Whether this reflects historical reality or Byzantine literary convention about women's roles, we cannot know. What matters is that she went. In the spring of 988 AD, a Byzantine fleet carried her to Cherson. Vladimir received baptism in Cherson. The exact details are unclear in the sources. Some say he was already baptized before Anna arrived. Others say he went blind, and his sight was miraculously restored upon baptism, a literary miracle too convenient to be entirely trusted. So, power say, what we can say with certainty is that Vladimir emerged from the waters a Christian, taking the baptismal name Basil in honor of the emperor. The wedding followed. A Byzantine princess married a Rus prince in a former Greek colony on the Crimean shore. The ceremony must have been Orthodox, conducted with all the ritual that Byzantine Christianity could muster, a visible demonstration of Vladimir's new faith and new status. He was no longer merely a barbarian warlord. He was now a Delphos, a brother in Christ to the emperors themselves, bound to them through both his baptism and his marriage. He released Cherson back to Byzantine control, a gesture of goodwill and a sign that conquest had been means rather than end. He took Anna back to Kiev, along with priests and holy relics, with icons and liturgical vessels, with everything needed to establish Christianity properly in his realm. The Rus warriors he had promised were sent to Constantinople, where they helped defeat Bardas Phocas and would eventually form the nucleus of the famous Varangian Guard, the elite unit of Scandinavian warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguard for centuries to come. Vladimir had played the game brilliantly. He had forced the Byzantines to treat him as an equal. He had gained a wife whose bloodline carried the prestige of Rome itself. He had adopted a religion that would give him access to Byzantine trade and diplomacy while allowing worship in Slavic language. He had positioned Kiev as a major Christian power, worthy of respect and alliance. Now came the harder part, converting his people, dismantling the pagan structures he himself had built, transforming Rus society from top to bottom. The treaty signed with emperors was one thing. The baptism of millions was another. Baptism in the Dnieper. You stand in the Dnieper River on a summer morning in the year 988 AD. The water reaches your waist, cool and flowing, pulling gently at your legs with the current. All around you, as far as you can see in both directions, hundreds of people stand in the water, perhaps thousands. The entire city of Kiev has come down from the hills to the riverbank, summoned by Prince Vladimir's command. You are not entirely certain what is happening. You heard the proclamation. Everyone must come to the river. Everyone must be baptized. Those who refuse will be considered enemies of the prince. The threat was clear enough, but the meaning, the implications, the theology behind this moment, these things are less clear to you. You watched yesterday as Vladimir's men destroyed the idols. Perun, with his silver head and golden moustache, was tied to a horse's tail and dragged through the city, beaten with sticks, then cast into the Dnieper. Some people wept to see it, others watched in stony silence. You felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. The gods you had known all your life, the gods your parents and grandparents honoured, were being thrown down and drowned. What would happen now? Would Perun send lightning in vengeance? Would the crops fail? Would the steppe nomads overwhelm the city? But nothing happened. The idols floated downstream, driftwood stripped of divine power, and the sky remained clear. Perhaps this itself was a message. Perhaps the old gods were powerless, or perhaps they did not exist at all. You do not know what to think. Byzantine priests stand on the shore, men in strange robes speaking Greek and Slavic with thick accents. They hold crosses and icons, images painted on wooden panels showing a man with a golden halo, a woman in blue robes, figures you do not recognize, but which clearly carry great significance to these foreign holy men. Incense burns somewhere upwind, the scent drifting across the water, sweet and resinous, unlike anything in your experience. One of the priests raises his arms and begins to chant. The words wash over you, half understood. Something about Father and Son and Holy Spirit. Something about washing away sins. Something about being born again through water. You catch phrases but not meaning. Around you, people shift nervously in the water, uncertain what to do, waiting for instruction. The priest makes a gesture, a complex sign with his hand, touching forehead and chest and shoulders. Some people try to imitate it. You watch, learning. This is how Christians mark themselves, apparently. This is their symbol, their recognition signal. More chanting. The priest calls on God, on Christ, on saints whose names you have never heard. The liturgy flows over you like the river itself. Incomprehensible but strangely compelling. There is rhythm to it, a cadence that carries meaning beyond words. You find yourself swaying slightly, matching the rhythm without conscious decision. Then the priests wade into the water, moving among the people, making the sign over each person's head, speaking words of blessing. One approaches you. He is young, probably not much older than you, with a dark beard and kind eyes. He places his hand on your head, gently pushing down. You understand. You take a breath and duck under the water. The world becomes muffled, sound and green light. You feel the current pulling at you, the coolness against your scalp. For a moment, you are suspended between air and earth, neither fully in one realm nor the other. Is this what death feels like? Or birth? You surface, gasping, water streaming from your hair and face. The priest is smiling, saying something in Greek you cannot understand, but his tone is welcoming. He makes the sign of the cross over you again, then moves on to the next person. You are Christian now, apparently. You do not feel different. The same doubts, the same hungers, the same daily concerns occupy your mind. But something has changed. Officially, if not internally. You are part of something new, part of Vladimir's plan, part of a transformation whose scope you cannot yet grasp. You look toward the shore and see Prince Vladimir himself standing there, watching his people undergo the change he has mandated. He stands with Anna, his Byzantine bride, a small woman in elaborate robes who looks uncomfortable in the summer heat. Around them, armed guards keep watch, but there is no sense of threat here. This is celebration, not conquest. The people have come willingly, or willing enough. You wonder what your children will think of this day, decades from now. Will they remember that their parents were baptized as adults, that there was a time before Christianity in Rus? Or will orthodoxy become so natural, so integrated into daily life, that the pagan past will seem like a dream, half-remembered and unreal? The priest's chanting continues. More people duck under the water and emerge transformed, at least in theory. The sun climbs higher, warming the air, sparkling on the river's surface. Downstream, somewhere out of sight, the broken remnants of Perun drift toward the Black Sea. Gods become debris. Upstream, in the churches that Vladimir is already planning, new images will be painted, new prayers will be spoken, new rituals will bind people together. You wade toward the shore, water dripping from your clothes. You are Christian now, whatever that means. Time will teach you. Stone and word. Vladimir's conversion was not merely personal or even communal, it was imperial, a decision that reshaped institutions and built new structures to embody the new faith. Within months of the baptism in the Dnieper, construction began throughout Kiev. The wooden city would acquire stone buildings, permanent markers of Christianity's arrival. The Church of the Tithes rose on the hill above the river, Kiev's first stone church. Vladimir decreed that a tenth of his revenues would support it, hence the name. Byzantine architects and craftsmen came north, bringing techniques unknown to Rus builders. They laid foundations deep and strong. They shaped limestone and brick. They created walls that would stand for centuries, a visible commitment that could not be easily reversed. Imagine the labour involved. Stone had to be quarried and transported, lime had to be burned for mortar, timber scaffolding had to be erected. Skilled masons had to work alongside unskilled labourers, Greeks supervising Slavs, knowledge passing from experienced hands to apprentices. The building rose slowly, year by year, a testament to patience and resources. The church was consecrated to the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, the God-bearer. Its interior was decorated with frescoes and mosaics in the Byzantine style. Images appeared that Rus eyes had never seen before, or had seen only in icons brought by merchants. Christ Pantocrator, the Almighty, gazing down from the dome, the Virgin with the Christ child, tender and hieratic simultaneously, saints and apostles, arranged according to Byzantine theological principles, creating a cosmology in paint and stone. Vladimir brought the bones of Saint Clement, allegedly found in Cherson, to rest in the new church. Relics were essential to medieval Christianity, physical connections to the divine, proof that holiness could inhabit matter. The presence of Clement's bones, a pope martyred in the 1st century AD, gave Kiev a link to the earliest days of Christianity, a claim to apostolic authority. But stone churches alone could not create a Christian civilization. Literacy was required. The faith was a religion of the book, of scripture and liturgy, of written prayers and theological texts. If Rus Christianity was to be more than superficial, more than mere ceremony without understanding, then literacy had to spread beyond the tiny minority who already possessed it. Here, Vladimir benefited from work done a century earlier. Cyril and Methodius, Byzantine missionaries to the Slavic peoples, had created an alphabet specifically designed for Slavic sounds. They had begun translating scripture and liturgical texts into Old Church Slavonic, a language closely related to the Slavic dialects spoken in Rus territories. This meant that worship could occur in a language the people understood, or could learn to understand, rather than Greek or Latin. Vladimir established schools, bringing in teachers from Bulgaria, where Slavic Christianity was already established, recruiting priests who could read and write Slavonic. The sons of the nobility were compelled to attend, to learn letters whether they wanted to or not. The Primary Chronicle records mothers weeping as their children were taken for education, mourning as if for the dead. But Vladimir was insistent. The next generation of Rus leaders would be literate Christians. Monasteries began to appear, first slowly, then with increasing frequency. These institutions served multiple purposes. They were centers of prayer and asceticism, where men and women withdrew from the world to focus on spiritual perfection. But they were also centers of learning. Scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied, libraries where texts were preserved, schools where literacy was taught. Byzantine monastic rules were adapted to Rus conditions. The spiritual technology of the Orthodox East took root in Rus soil. Churches multiplied beyond the Church of the Tithes. Vladimir is said to have built numerous wooden churches throughout Kiev and in other cities. Each required priests to serve. Each became a center for Christian community. Sunday liturgy replaced or supplemented older feast days. Christian calendar began to structure time differently. Baptism, marriage, burial, all became Christian ceremonies, marked by Christian ritual, supervised by Christian clergy. The old gods did not disappear overnight. In villages far from Kiev, in rural areas beyond princely authority, pagan practices persisted for generations. Some blended with Christianity in forms the Byzantine hierarchy would not have recognized or approved. Folk practices, village traditions, seasonal celebrations continued, but acquired Christian overlays were reinterpreted through Christian frameworks. The transformation was real, but incomplete, thorough in cities, but superficial in the countryside. Vladimir himself underwent a personal transformation. According to the sources, the man who had maintained a vast harem now embraced Christian monogamy, keeping Anna as his only wife, dismissing the others. The man who had sacrificed to pagan gods now built churches and gave alms to the poor. The sources emphasize his generosity, his feeding of the hungry, his charity to beggars and widows. Whether this represents genuine conversion or merely political theatre, we cannot know. Perhaps both, sincere conviction expressed through actions that also served political purposes. By the time of Vladimir's death in 1015 AD, Kievan Rus was officially Christian. Churches dotted the landscape, priests served the liturgy. The Bible existed in Slavonic. Schools taught literacy to the elite. The institutional infrastructure of Byzantine Christianity had been transplanted north, adapted to local conditions but recognizably orthodox. The transformation Vladimir had initiated was irreversible. Whatever else happened to Kievan Rus, it would happen as a Christian civilization. But Christianity alone did not make Kiev great. The golden age of Rus culture required peace, stability, wise governance, and fortunate circumstances. It required a prince who understood both power and culture, who could consolidate authority while encouraging learning. It required Vladimir's son, Yaroslav, who would not inherit power easily, but would use it brilliantly once gained. The wise prince. Vladimir's death in 1015 AD triggered the succession crisis that everyone had feared, but no one had prevented. He had many sons from multiple wives, and though he had embraced Christian monogamy late in life, his earlier unions produced claimants whose ambitions exceeded the available thrones. Civil war was inevitable. Sviatopolk, one of Vladimir's sons, seized Kiev and began eliminating rivals. Boris and Gleb, two of the most beloved princes, were murdered on Sviatopolk's orders, or with his approval. The circumstances of their deaths, their supposed acceptance of martyrdom rather than resistance, would make them the first Rus saints, passion-bearers, who chose death over fratricide. But their sanctity came after the fact. In the moment, their deaths were simply murders in a brutal power struggle. Yaroslav, ruling in Novgorod, refused to submit to Sviatopolk's authority. He gathered forces, including Varangian mercenaries, hired with Novgorodian silver. The two brothers fought for years, armies clashing on frozen rivers and in muddy fields. Eventually, around 1019 AD, Yaroslav triumphed. Sviatopolk fled west and died in exile. Yaroslav entered Kiev as its sole prince, but only after the city had endured years of violence and uncertainty. The sources call him Yaroslav the Wise, a title that suggests both intellectual ability and political acumen. The evidence supports the epithet. Yaroslav was literate in an age when most warriors were not. interested in books and learning, a patron of scholars and church builders. But he was also pragmatic, capable of ruthlessness when necessary, skilled at the political calculations required to maintain power in a fractious realm. He faced continued challenges. A brother named Mstislav ruled in Tmutarakan on the Black Sea and refused to submit. Rather than fight endlessly, Yaroslav negotiated a division, acknowledging Mstislav's autonomy in the east, in exchange for recognition of Yaroslav's supremacy in Kiev and the west. When Mstislav died in 1036 AD, without heirs, the territories reunited under Yaroslav peacefully, with internal challenges resolved. Yaroslav turned his attention to external threats and opportunities. The Pechenegs, steppe nomads who had raided Rus territories for decades, launched a major attack on Kiev in 1036 AD. Yaroslav met them in battle outside the city walls and inflicted a crushing defeat. The Pecheneg threat effectively ended that day. Yaroslav commemorated the victory by building a church on the battlefield, dedicated to Saint Sophia, Holy Wisdom, a building that would become Kiev's architectural crown. Under Yaroslav's rule, Kiev flourished. The city expanded beyond its original hills. New fortifications were built, including a golden gate that echoed Constantinople's famous entrance. The population swelled with merchants and artisans, priests and scholars, warriors and farmers. Estimates vary wildly, but by the mid-11th century AD, Kiev may have housed 40,000 or even 50,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. Yaroslav codified laws, creating the Russkaya Pravda, the first written legal code in Rus history. He patronized literature and learning, establishing libraries and supporting the translation of Greek texts into Slavonic. He founded schools and monasteries. He commissioned chronicles that would preserve Rus history. Under his patronage, Kiev became not merely a trading center, but a cultural capital. His reign marked the apex of Kievan power and prestige. Contemporary European sources mention Kiev with respect, sometimes with awe. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler, called Kiev the rival of Constantinople, hyperbole perhaps, but indicative of the city's reputation. Kiev was where cultures met, where Byzantine Christianity encountered Norse energy, where Slavic traditions mixed with international commerce, where learning and trade and power converged. Yaroslav himself embodied this synthesis. He was descended from Scandinavian Rurik through his father's line, from Slavic and perhaps Turkic ancestors through his mother. He was Orthodox Christian, but married to a Swedish princess. He ruled a realm that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Volga River. His court was cosmopolitan, hosting merchants from across the known world, entertaining foreign princes, arranging marriages that would connect Rus to every major power in Europe. He was not without flaws. The sources hint at conflicts with his sons, at tensions over inheritance and authority. He could be harsh when challenged, but compared to the chaos that preceded him and the fragmentation that would follow, his reign shone like a brief golden afternoon, warm and productive, and somehow precious, precisely because it could not last. Yaroslav ruled for 35 years, from 1019 to 1054 AD, longer than any of his predecessors. Long enough to build, to consolidate, to create institutions that would outlive him. Long enough for a generation to grow up knowing only his rule, seeing Kiev's splendor as normal rather than remarkable. Long enough to make people forget that power was always temporary, that realms built by one man's will could fragment at his death. He was literate, pious, politically skilled, militarily successful, culturally ambitious, and diplomatically brilliant. The sources remember him with genuine affection, unusual for medieval chronicles that often emphasize flaws as much as virtues. He was the wise prince, the good king, the high watermark against which later rulers would be measured and found wanting. But before we consider what happened after his death, we should visit his greatest monument, the building that captured everything he hoped Kiev would become, the Cathedral of Holy Wisdom. St. Sophia Cathedral stands yet, despite centuries and wars and revolutions, its walls thick enough to withstand time's assault. But we cannot visit the building as it exists now, renovated and modified by later generations. We must imagine it as it appeared in the mid-11th century AD, newly completed, its mosaics gleaming, its scale overwhelming everyone who approached. The building rises on the high ground where Yaroslav defeated the Pechenegs. Its very location proclaims victory, Christian triumph over pagan nomads, divine favour manifested in stone. From a distance, you see multiple domes, 13 of them in the original design, each topped with a cross, catching sunlight and radiating it back across the city. The domes create a skyline unlike anything else in Rus, a statement of ambition and piety. As you approach, the scale becomes apparent. This is not a wooden chapel or even a modest stone church. This is a cathedral, designed to awe and instruct, to make the physical embody the theological. Byzantine architects supervised the construction, but Rus craftsmen did much of the work, learning techniques as they built, absorbing knowledge that would pass to future generations. You enter through massive wooden doors. The interior opens before you, vast and echoing. Light streams through windows, high in the walls and drums beneath the domes, illuminating the space with a quality different from outdoor light, softer somehow, filtered through coloured glass, made sacred by its passage through holy architecture. Your eyes adjust, and you begin to see the mosaics. In the central dome, Christ Pantocrator gazes down, the Almighty, the Judge, his right hand raised in blessing, his left holding the Book of Gospels. His face is stern but not cruel, authoritative without being frightening. Around him in the drum of the dome, the Virgin Mary intercedes, her hands raised in prayer, standing between humanity and divine judgment. The mosaics are not painting, they are thousands of tiny coloured stones, glass tesserae arranged to create images that shimmer as you move, catching light differently from different angles, never quite static, always subtly shifting. Gold backgrounds radiate light, making the figures seem to float in celestial space. Blues and greens and reds, purple and white and brown, the entire spectrum arranged in service of theology. The scent reaches you gradually. Incense burning somewhere in the sanctuary, myrrh and frankincense, aromatics from distant lands brought north for this specific purpose. The smell adheres to the stone, saturates the air, creates an olfactory environment distinct from the outside world. Breathing here is different. Each breath carries the scent of prayer. Sound behaves strangely in this space. Voices echo and blend. When the choir sings, the music fills the entire volume, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, voices multiplying in the stone vault, about creating harmonies not written into the music, but generated by the architecture itself. Byzantine chant, 8-tone system, words in Slavonic, but melody from Constantinople, another synthesis of Greek and Slavic elements. The floor is polished stone, cool beneath your feet. The walls rise to tremendous heights, creating a vertical dimension that pulls your eyes upward, encouraging thoughts of heaven, of transcendence, of realms beyond the earthly. Light descends from above. Prayer rises to meet it. The building itself teaches theology through spatial arrangement. In the apse behind the altar, a massive mosaic of the Virgin Mary spreads her arms in the position of prayer. She is enormous, dominating the eastern wall, the Oranta, the praying one, interceding eternally for the city and its people. Gold surrounds her. She wears deep blue robes. Her face, repeated in thousands of tiny stones, manages somehow to convey both sorrow and hope. Along the walls, frescoes tell biblical stories and depict saints. Adam and Eve in the garden, Noah and the ark, Abraham and Isaac, Moses and the commandments, the Annunciation, the Nativity, the crucifixion, the resurrection. The entire Christian narrative unfolds in images, visible theology for people who cannot read, a Bible in pictures. But there are also scenes from secular life, surprising in a religious building. In one section, frescoes show musicians and acrobats, dancers and performers, images of earthly entertainment that seem out of place in a cathedral. Scholars debate their meaning. Perhaps they represent the worldly pleasures being transcended. Perhaps they are simply decoration, beautification for its own sake. The building contains mysteries, questions that 12 centuries have not fully answered. Yaroslav spared no expense: gold and silver vessels for the liturgy, relics of saints brought from Constantinople and elsewhere, vestments of silk and brocade for the clergy, icons painted by master artists. Everything that wealth could purchase and skill could create went into St. Sophia, making it not merely a church but a statement, a declaration that Kiev belonged among the great Christian cities of the world. When you emerge from the cathedral back into ordinary daylight, the world seems diminished, less colourful, less significant. The building has done its work, creating in you a sense that the divine realm is more real than the material one, that holiness can inhabit stone and glass, that heaven touches earth in specific places, prepared for the meeting. This was Yaroslav's vision made material, his understanding of what Kiev could become, his legacy to future generations. As long as St. Sophia stood, Kiev was more than a trading post, more than a collection of wooden buildings, more than a stopping point on the river highway. It was a city worthy of God's attention, a place where heaven and earth met, a rival in its own way to Constantinople itself. The Russkaya Pravda, a civilization is known by its laws, the codes it creates, the punishments it decrees, the protections it offers. These reveal what a society values and how it understands justice. In establishing written law for Kievan Rus, Yaroslav created a document that illuminates his realm with remarkable clarity. The Russkaya Pravda, the Russian truth, or Russian justice, was not comprehensive legislation, covering every possible situation. It was more limited, more practical, a collection of rules dealing primarily with property rights, personal injury, and criminal penalties. But within its clauses, we see the structure of Rus society, the relationships between classes, the mechanisms for resolving disputes. The code establishes a system of fines for various offences, calculated in monetary terms, but revealing social hierarchies. Killing a prince's retainer, a senior member of the military elite, brought a fine of 80 grivnas, a substantial sum. Killing an ordinary free person cost 40 grivnas. A slave's death brought only 5 or 6 grivnas, compensation to the owner, paid not for the slave's humanity but for lost property. These numbers are shocking to modern sensibilities, but they reflect 11th century realities. Life had different values depending on social status. And also, justice was not blind but acutely aware of hierarchy. A noble's life mattered more than a commoner's, and a slave hardly mattered at all, except as economic loss to their owner. The code addresses theft with elaborate detail. Stealing a horse brought one penalty, stealing a weapon another, stealing goods from a boat moored at the shore yet another. The specificity suggests these were common problems requiring regulation. The Dnieper trade route created opportunities for theft, and the code tried to discourage such crimes through clear punishments. Interestingly, the Russkaya Pravda shows little influence of Byzantine law. Despite Rus Christianity coming from Constantinople, Byzantine legal traditions stretch back to Justinian's code, and ultimately to Roman law, sophisticated systems that had developed over centuries. Rus law was simpler, more focused on practical resolution of specific disputes, less interested in legal philosophy or comprehensive coverage. The code also reveals the importance of witnesses and oaths. Disputes could be settled by swearing, by finding people to vouch for one's truthfulness, by reputation and community standing. In a society where literacy was limited, where written contracts were rare, personal honour and communal memory served as enforcement mechanisms. Your word had value because people knew you, because breaking your oath would destroy your reputation and make future commerce impossible. Women appear in the code primarily in relation to men, as wives, daughters, mothers. A woman who was assaulted could claim compensation, but the amount varied based on her social status and marital state. A noble woman received more than a commoner, a married woman more than an unmarried one. The law protected women, but within a framework that treated them as belonging to male-headed households. Slavery is acknowledged matter-of-factly. People became slaves through various means: capture in war, debt, birth to enslaved parents, voluntary self-sale to escape starvation. Once enslaved, they had few protections. The law cared about damage to slaves only insofar as it affected owners' property rights. This was not unique to Rus. Slavery was common throughout medieval Europe and beyond. But seeing it codified, made explicitly legal and regulated, reminds us of the moral blind spots that allowed such institutions to flourish. The code distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm. If you killed someone in a drunken brawl, that was one thing. If you killed someone by accident, say in a hunting mishap, that was another, bringing lesser penalties. The distinction suggests a society thinking about culpability, about the relationship between intent and consequence, about justice requiring more than automatic revenge. Blood feuds are acknowledged but regulated. If someone was killed, their relatives had the right to seek vengeance, but this right was limited. They could kill the killer, but then the matter was supposed to end. The code tried to prevent spiraling cycles of revenge to contain violence within bounds. In practice, this regulation was probably only partially successful, but the attempt itself is significant. Comparing the Russkaya Pravda to other early medieval codes reveals both universals and particulars. Many European societies developed similar systems around the same time. Wergold in Anglo-Saxon England, similar blood price systems in Scandinavia and Germany, various codes throughout Christian Europe. All tried to replace unlimited revenge with regulated compensation to create mechanisms for dispute resolution that didn't require perpetual warfare, but the Rus code has its own character. The social categories are specific to Rus conditions. The attention to trade disputes reflects Kiev's commercial nature. The penalties and procedures grew from Rus experience, not copied wholesale from elsewhere. Yaroslav and his legal scholars created something that fit their society's needs. The Russkaya Pravda was not static. Later princes added to it, modified it, adapted it to changing circumstances. What began as Yaroslav's code became an evolving body of law that served Rus society for centuries. The basic principles endured: restitution over revenge, fines over death penalties for most crimes, clear social hierarchies explicitly encoded in law. For historians, the code is invaluable. Where chronicles might exaggerate or mythologize, where hagiographies present idealized versions of reality, legal codes reveal what actually worried people, what disputes actually occurred, how society actually functioned in its daily operations. We learn that horse theft was common enough to require specific legislation, that slaves tried to escape, and that recapturing them was important enough to codify, that honor killings happened and needed regulation, that boat cargo was valuable enough to protect explicitly. Yaroslav's creation of a written legal code marked another step in Rus civilization's development. Oral tradition and customary law were being supplemented, eventually replaced, by written statutes that could be consulted, studied, applied consistently across distance and time. This required literacy among judges and administrators, creating demand for education, supporting the schools and churches Yaroslav had established. Law, architecture, liturgy, learning. These were the foundations of the Golden Age, the institutional infrastructure that made Kiev more than a collection of warriors and merchants. Yaroslav understood that greatness required more than military victory. It required justice, culture, visible magnificence, connection to the wider world, and in connection to that wider world, Yaroslav proved himself a master. The royal road. Yaroslav's most brilliant political achievement was not military conquest or legal innovation, but marriage diplomacy. Through careful arrangement of unions between his children and the ruling houses of Europe, he positioned Kiev at the center of an international network that elevated Rus status beyond anything his predecessors had achieved. Consider the marriages arranged during his reign. His daughter, Anastasia, married Andrew I of Hungary, becoming queen of that realm. His daughter Elizabeth married Harald Hardrada of Norway, the famous Viking warrior who had served in the Byzantine Varangian Guard before claiming the Norwegian throne. That same Elizabeth, after Harold's death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 AD, married Sweyn Estridsson of Denmark, giving her 2 kingdoms in succession. But the most spectacular match was for his daughter Anna. In 1049 AD, she travelled west to marry Henry I of France, becoming Queen of the Franks. Think about what this meant. A Rus princess, granddaughter of Vladimir the recent pagan, great-granddaughter of Sviatoslav the fierce warrior, sitting on a throne that traced its lineage to Charlemagne, to the Carolingians, to the very foundation of Western medieval kingship. Anna brought sophistication to the French court. She could read and write, unusual for women of her time, even royal women. She signed documents in Cyrillic, while her husband Henry signed with a cross, unable to write his own name. Letters survive bearing her signature, proof of her literacy, an active role in governance. She served as regent for her young son, Philip I, after Henry's death, ruling France during the boy's minority, a Rus princess governing the kingdom of the Franks. Yaroslav's sons also married, strategically. Vsevolod wed a Byzantine princess, daughter of Constantine Monomachos, connecting Kiev directly to the imperial family in Constantinople. Yaroslav married a Polish princess, strengthening ties to the West. Every marriage was a treaty, every child a potential alliance, every union a thread in the web of international relations. These marriages were not merely political calculation, though they were certainly that. They reflected Kiev's status. European kings did not marry their daughters to barbarian chiefs. They married them to peers, to rulers of comparable rank and importance. The willingness of French, Norwegian, Hungarian, and Byzantine royal houses to accept Yaroslav's children as spouses indicated that Kiev was recognized as a legitimate major power, a realm worthy of respect and alliance. The cosmopolitan nature of Yaroslav's court attracted others beyond marriage partners. Harald Hardrada himself spent time in Kiev before claiming Norway, finding refuge there after his adventures in Byzantium, perhaps conducting his courtship of Elizabeth in Yaroslav's halls. Foreign merchants were numerous, creating a permanent international presence. Visiting diplomats reported back to their home courts about Kiev's splendor. The traffic flowed both directions. Yaroslav sent embassies to Constantinople regularly, maintaining the relationship established by Vladimir. He exchanged gifts with the German emperor. He corresponded with the Pope, though he remained firmly Orthodox and had no intention of accepting papal authority. The point was communication, visibility, participation in the network of European diplomacy. Religious connections reinforced political ones. Byzantine bishops and priests served in Kiev, but so did clergy from other Orthodox regions. Bulgarian monks brought manuscripts. Greek scholars translated texts. The Orthodox world was itself international, creating cultural ties that transcended political boundaries. Kiev was becoming a center of Orthodox Christianity beyond merely practicing it, attracting pilgrims and scholars, housing important relics, building churches that rivaled Constantinople's. Economic ties supported everything else. The trade routes that had given birth to Kiev still functioned, still brought wealth. Byzantine merchants still traveled the Dnieper. Western European goods increasingly appeared in Rus markets as connections to the West strengthened. The Baltic trade linked Kiev to Scandinavia, and through Scandinavia to the North Sea and beyond. Silver from Islamic lands still flowed through the Volga route, despite Khazar decline. Yaroslav understood what many rulers miss, that wealth and culture create more durable power than military force alone. Armies win battles, but educated children speaking multiple languages, marrying into foreign courts, maintaining correspondence across distances, create alliances that survive changes in leadership. Commerce creates mutual interests that war disrupts to everyone's loss. Magnificent buildings and sophisticated legal codes earn respect that raids and conquests cannot. The network Yaroslav built was personal, dependent on his prestige and his children's positions. It would not survive his death intact, but while it lasted, it made Kiev genuinely international, a place where Norwegian warriors, Byzantine priests, German merchants, French nobles, and countless others might find themselves sharing space, conducting business, participating in a cosmopolitan culture unique in Eastern Europe. Modern Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus all claim Yaroslav as ancestor, argue over his legacy, cite his reign as proof of their legitimacy or importance. This itself testifies to his success. A ruler whose achievements still generate controversy 12 centuries after his death was clearly significant. Yaroslav made Kiev matter in ways that endured beyond his lifetime, created memories and structures that could not be entirely erased, even by the catastrophes that followed. But all golden ages contain the seeds of their decline. Yaroslav's very success created problems. His multiple sons all expected inheritance. All had been raised as princes. All commanded resources and loyalty. The realm he built was too large for one man to rule effectively. Given 11th century communications and transportation, regional centres had grown strong during his reign, wealthy and semi-autonomous. Unity depended on Yaroslav's personal authority. What would happen when that authority died with him? What would happen when the sons began competing for their father's throne? What would happen when the carefully balanced system of alliances and marriages faced the stress of succession crisis? Yaroslav knew these questions loomed. He tried to plan for them, to create a system that would prevent civil war. He failed, not through lack of wisdom or foresight, but because some problems have no solution, because human ambition and accident exceed any system's capacity to control. The golden afternoon of his reign was ending. Shadows lengthened, fragmentation approached. A day in the life of Kiev. You wake in Kiev on a spring morning, in the year 1050 AD, and the city is already alive with activity. You are not nobility, not a prince or great merchant, but neither are you poor. You have a trade, perhaps as a craftsman or minor trader, enough to keep yourself fed and clothed with some small margin for comfort. Your home is wooden, like most buildings in Kiev, timber walls chinked with moss and clay, a thatched roof that needs repairing each autumn. You share the space with your family, a single room partitioned by hanging cloth, a central hearth for warmth and cooking. The air inside smells of wood smoke and last night's porridge, of wool and leather and human bodies. You dress quickly in the morning, chill, wrapping yourself in a woolen cloak over linen tunic and trousers. Outside, the street is busy. Kiev has grown enormously during Yaroslav's reign, sprawling across multiple hills. Tens of thousands of people crowded into wooden houses and workshops. The street itself is mud, as most streets are, churned by feet and hooves and cartwheels into a pace that clings to boots. Children run past, laughing and shouting in the early light, playing some game involving sticks and a leather ball. A dog barks somewhere nearby, answered by another farther away. You walk toward the market square, joining the flow of people heading in the same direction. The morning is cool but pleasant, the air carrying scents from everywhere. Bread baking in the communal ovens, the yeasty smell making your stomach rumble. Fish from the Dnieper, fresh or being smoked. Leather from the tanners down by the river, an acrid smell that makes you wrinkle your nose. Horse dung and human waste, the inevitable smells of any city in any era. The market is where the world comes to Kiev. You pass stalls, selling goods from a dozen lands. Furs from the northern forests, marten and sable and fox, the pelts soft under your fingers when you stop to examine them. The merchant speaks a mixture of Slavic and Norse, switching between languages depending on his customer. You overhear him negotiating with a Byzantine trader, the conversation half Slavic, half Greek, half gestures, and pointing. A woman sells honey in sealed clay jars, golden and thick, sweetness from forest hives. Another offers beeswax candles, yellow and fragrant, useful for those who can afford to light their homes with something better than tallow. Vegetables are being sold from baskets, last year's roots and this year's first greens, cabbage and turnips, onions and carrots. You hear church bells, bronze tones, echoing across the city. The call to morning prayer, though you are not heading to church now. You crossed yourself out of habit at the sound. The gesture, automatic after decades of Christianity. But your business today is secular. Still, the bells remind you that tomorrow is Sunday, that you will attend liturgy, that Christian calendar structures your week. A group of Varangian warriors passes through the market, tall men with long beards, and armed even here in peacetime. They speak Norse among themselves, a language you do not know, though you recognize its sound from long familiarity. One of them stops at a wine merchant's stall, examining amphoras of Byzantine wine, expensive stuff brought up the Dnieper at great cost. You cannot afford such luxuries, but you watch with interest as he haggles, the merchant defending his price, the warrior eventually agreeing with a nod and a handful of silver coins. Music drifts from somewhere, a stringed instrument playing a melody, someone practicing or perhaps performing for coins. The sound is pleasant, mixing with the general noise of commerce and conversation. Kiev is always full of sounds, voices in multiple languages, animals, craftsmen at work, wheels on cobblestones near the prince's halls, where the streets are paved. You conduct your business, whatever it is, buying or selling or trading, the daily work that sustains you. The people you deal with are familiar faces, regular contacts, relationships built over years of transactions. Trust matters in commerce, reputation counts, and in a city this size you can still know your trading partners personally, still rely on word of honor, backed by community knowledge. Midday approaches, and you seek food. Bread from a baker, cheese from a dairy seller, perhaps a bit of smoked fish. You eat while walking, watching the city flow around you. A wedding procession passes, the bride and groom young and nervous, accompanied by singing relatives and a priest in vestments. Everyone who sees them calls out blessings, wishing them children and prosperity, and you add your voice to theirs. Near the prince's compound on the high hill, you see St. Sophia rising, its domes bright in the midday sun, larger than any building you ever imagined before its construction. Guards stand at the gates to Yaroslav's hall, armed men who watch everyone with professional suspicion, but there is no sense of danger. The city is peaceful, prosperous, confident. You return home in the afternoon, your business concluded, and join neighbours in some task or conversation. Perhaps you help repair a fence or lend tools. Perhaps you simply sit and talk, discussing the day's events, sharing gossip, arguing about something trivial. Community happens in these small interactions, bonds forming through proximity and repeated contact. Evening comes, and you eat with your family, bread and porridge, vegetables and occasionally meat. Simple food but sufficient. Your children ask questions, the younger ones chattering about their day, the older ones with more serious concerns. You think about their futures, what trades they might learn, what marriages might be arranged. Life in Kiev offers possibilities that would not exist in a village. Your children might rise further than you have, might make connections that bring prosperity. As darkness falls, you light a small oil lamp, expensive but necessary for a few hours of useful light. In that light, perhaps you do accounts if you can read numbers, or perhaps you simply sit with family, talking quietly until sleep seems appealing. Outside, the city quiets but never silences entirely. Dogs bark, footsteps pass in the street, voices call to each other. Kiev breathes even at night, a living thing of wood and stone and water, of thousands of human lives, intersecting and diverging. You sleep in your wooden house in the great city, on the Dnieper, under the protection of Prince Yaroslav, within the sound of church bells, surrounded by merchants and warriors, priests and craftsmen, all the variety of humanity that the trade routes have drawn to this place. Tomorrow will be much like today, and the day after, much like tomorrow. Life in Kiev feels stable, permanent, as if this golden age could last forever. But you are wrong. Change approaches, hidden in the future, inevitable as the rivers flow. The division of the land. Yaroslav died in 1054 AD, and with him died the last realistic hope of unified Rus. He had tried to prevent the chaos that followed Vladimir's death, had created a system meant to preserve both unity and peace. He divided the realm among his sons, assigning each a principality to rule, establishing Kiev as the senior throne, with a system of rotation meant to ensure that the oldest surviving brother would always rule the capital. The theory was elegant. The practice was disaster. 5 sons survived: Yaroslav, Izyaslav, Sviatoslav, Vsevolod, Igor, and Vyacheslav. Under the rotation system, Izyaslav as eldest took Kiev. When he died, Sviatoslav would move from his principality to Kiev, and everyone would shift up. When Sviatoslav died, Vsevolod would become Prince of Kiev, and so on. In theory, this prevented any one branch of the family from monopolizing power, while ensuring experienced rulers led the senior principality. In practice, it created endless conflict. What happened when a junior prince died before his older brothers? Did his sons inherit his position in the rotation, or were they skipped? What if a prince was forced out of Kiev by rivals but did not die? Did his time in exile count against his claim? What if multiple princes of roughly equal seniority claimed Kiev simultaneously? The system also created perverse incentives. If you were a junior prince ruling a prosperous territory like Chernigov or Pereyaslav, why improve it? Why invest in buildings and defences when you would eventually have to leave for Kiev and someone else would inherit your improvements? Better to extract maximum short-term profit and let the next prince worry about long-term consequences. Within years of Yaroslav's death, the system broke down. Iziaslav ruled Kiev, but faced constant challenges. His brother Sviatoslav allied with steppe nomads against him. Vesvolod sometimes supported Iziaslav, sometimes undermined him, playing both sides to maximize his own advantage. Princes were driven out of Kiev, then returned, then were driven out again. The throne that Yaroslav had held for 35 years became a prize fought over constantly, its authority diminished by the frequency of turnover. In 1068 AD, a Turkic warlord named Vseslav of Polotsk actually seized Kiev for a brief period, holding it 7 months before being expelled. The fact that a non-Yaroslavich could even attempt this showed how far Kiev's authority had fallen. 10 years earlier, under Yaroslav, such an attack would have been unthinkable. Regional principalities grew stronger as Kiev grew weaker. Novgorod in the north had always been somewhat autonomous, its merchant oligarchy jealous of its privileges. Now it became effectively independent, inviting princes to rule but maintaining the real power in the hands of the Veche, the city assembly. Vladimir and Suzdal, in the northeast, founded as frontier outposts, grew into significant cities with their own resources and ambitions. Galicia Volhynia in the southwest, close to the Carpathian Mountains and to Polish and Hungarian territories, developed its own power base. Polotsk in the northwest remained quasi-independent under its own dynasty. Chernigov and Pereyaslav in the south-central region sometimes supported Kiev, sometimes opposed it, depending on the particular prince's interests at that moment. The endless princely feuding had economic consequences. Merchants faced uncertainty about which prince controlled which territory, whether treaties signed with one ruler would be honoured by his successor. The trade routes still functioned but less securely. Investment declined as stability decreased. Some merchants redirected their caravans, seeking routes through more stable regions, even if less profitable. Culturally, the fragmentation had mixed effects. On one hand, regional centres developed their own traditions, their own architectural styles, their own scribal schools. This diversification enriched Rus culture overall, creating variety and experimentation. Novgorod developed a unique artistic tradition, and Vladimir Suzdal built distinctive white stone churches. Multiple schools of icon painting emerged, each with its own characteristics. On the other hand, the grand projects Yaroslav had undertaken became increasingly rare. Who would fund a cathedral like St. Sophia when resources went to fortifications and military expeditions? Who would endow monasteries and libraries when survival required hiring more warriors? Culture requires surplus wealth and stable leadership, both of which became scarce as civil war became normal. External pressures increased as internal unity decreased. The Cumans, also called Polovtsians, a Turkic people from the eastern steppe, replaced the defeated Pechenegs as the primary threat. They raided Rus territories regularly, sometimes allying with one prince against another, playing the divided Rus against themselves. The steppe frontier became more dangerous, less stable, harder to defend. Byzantium, sensing Rus weakness, became less generous in trade terms, more demanding in diplomatic relations. The respectful treaties signed with Yaroslav's reign gave way to harder bargaining. Byzantine emperors understood that divided Rus could be exploited in ways unified Rus could not. The The sources from this period make depressing reading. The chronicles record battle after battle, alliance and betrayal, promises made and broken, princes who were cousins, who had grown up together in Yaroslav's court, now hired steppe nomads to burn each other's cities. Brothers blinded brothers to prevent them from claiming thrones. Nephews murdered uncles. The family that Yaroslav had tried to bind together through law and succession system instead tore itself apart through ambition and suspicion. Not all princes were equally guilty. Some tried genuinely to preserve unity, to honour the rotation system, to prevent the worst violence, but good intentions meant little when others had no such scruples. The system rewarded ruthlessness, punished restraint. The princes who succeeded were often those willing to do whatever victory required. By the late 11th century AD, Kiev's status as unquestioned capital was fading. It remained symbolically important, the mother of Rus cities, the place where Vladimir had been baptized, where Yaroslav had built St. Sophia, but symbolism was not sovereignty. Real power increasingly resided in regional centres, with princes who controlled their own territories, hired their own warriors, made their own alliances. The Rus were learning what many civilizations learn, that unity is fragile, that what one generation builds another can squander, that political systems depend on goodwill and restraint as much as law and structure. Yaroslav's rotation system was no worse than most succession systems, but no system could survive the combination of ambition, opportunity, and lack of central authority that characterized late 11th century Rus. And yet, one more prince would try. One more man would attempt to restore something of Yaroslav's vision, to reunite the squabbling principalities under one authority, to make the land of Rus mean something beyond geographic expression. His name was Vladimir Monomakh, and for a brief moment, he almost succeeded. Riders from the east, the steppe was always there, beyond the forests, beyond the rivers, a vast grassland that stretched to the horizon and beyond. It was a different world from Rus, operating by different rules, home to peoples whose way of life was fundamentally incompatible with sedentary civilization. And from that steppe came a constant pressure, a perpetual threat that shaped Rus history as much as any internal development. The Cumans entered Rus consciousness in the mid-11th century AD, appearing from the east, displacing previous steppe peoples, establishing themselves as the dominant nomadic power. They were Turkic, like the Pechenegs and Khazars before them, organized in clans and confederations, living in felt tents that could be packed and moved in hours, subsisting on herds of horses and sheep that grazed the endless grass. They were magnificent horsemen, trained from childhood to ride and shoot simultaneously, capable of covering vast distances quickly, appearing where defenders did not expect them. A Cuman raiding party could strike deep into Rus territory, plunder a settlement, and vanish back into the steppe before organized resistance could form. Fortifications meant little against enemies, who did not seek to hold ground, but simply to take movable wealth and retreat. The southern Rus principalities bore the brunt of Cuman pressure. Pereyaslavl in particular, positioned on the steppe frontier, suffered constant raids. Its princes became specialist steppe fighters, learning Cuman tactics, sometimes even adopting elements of Cuman dress and equipment. The frontier created a unique culture, Slavic and Turkic elements mixing, neither entirely Rus, nor entirely steppe, but something hybrid and harsh. Rus princes made the situation worse through their civil wars. When Sviatoslav fought Izyaslav for Kiev, he hired Cuman warriors. When other princes challenged their cousins, they too turned to the steppe for mercenaries. The Cumans were happy to accept payment in silver and plunder rights, happy to burn Christian cities if Christian princes would pay them to do so. The divided Rus thus taught the Cumans exactly where to strike, exactly how wealthy the towns were, exactly what defences existed. One event crystallized the tragedy of this situation. In 1085 AD, Prince Igor Sviatoslavich of Novgorod-Seversk, grandson of Yaroslav the Wise, led a campaign against the Cumans. He marched deep into the steppe with a small force, perhaps seeking glory, perhaps seeking to protect his territories, perhaps simply overconfident in his abilities. The Cumans surrounded him. After a brief resistance, Igor was captured along with his retinue. The disaster itself was bad enough, but what made it legendary was how it was remembered. A century later, an unknown poet composed the tale of Igor's campaign, one of the masterpieces of medieval Slavic literature. The poem mourns Igor's defeat, laments the division among Rus princes, calls for unity against the common foe. It uses nature imagery, solar eclipses, bird omens, dreamlike sequences to create an atmosphere of doom and heroism. "O land of Rus," the poem cries, "you are already far beyond the hills." The work became a touchstone of Rus cultural memory, recited and copied for centuries, surviving in a single manuscript until the original was destroyed in the Moscow fire of 1812 AD. But enough copies had been made that the text survived, and modern scholars still debate its dating, its authenticity, its meaning, whether it was composed shortly after Igor's campaign or much later. It captures something essential about the steppe frontier: the constant danger, the brave futility of individual heroism against overwhelming odds, the sorrow of civilization fragmenting while enemies gathered. The Cumans were not merely raiders. They were potential allies, potential trading partners, even potential converts. Some Rus princes married Cuman noblewomen, creating kinship ties that sometimes prevented raids. Trade occurred when warfare paused. Cumans appeared in Rus cities as merchants and envoys, not just as enemies. The relationship was complex, shifting, never entirely hostile or entirely friendly. But the raids never stopped entirely. Villages were burned, captives were taken to be sold as slaves in distant markets, livestock were driven off, fields were trampled. The borderlands became depopulated zones, where settlement was dangerous, where only the desperate or the heavily defended could survive. The southern steppe frontier, which under Vladimir and Yaroslav had been pushed back, now advanced north again, eating into Rus territory, creating a running sore that drained resources and lives. The constant warfare also created a military culture, particularly among the southern princes. They became professional warriors in a way their grandfathers had not needed to be. They learned to fight mounted, to use composite bows, to conduct raids and ambushes. They became harder men, less interested in books and liturgy, more focused on survival and martial prowess. This was not necessarily degeneration, merely adaptation to circumstances. The steppe frontier shaped Rus history in another way, one that would become clear only later. It directed Rus expansion northward and eastward, away from the dangerous south. The Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, in the northeastern forests beyond Cuman reach, grew wealthy and powerful precisely because it was safe. Merchants and settlers fled north, seeking security that the south no longer provided. The demographic and economic center of Rus civilization was shifting, slowly but inexorably, away from Kiev toward the interior. This northward shift would have profound consequences. When catastrophe came from the east in the 13th century AD, when a threat far worse than the Cumans appeared, it would strike a civilization already weakened by internal division and external pressure. The Rus would not be ready, could not be ready, because they had spent a century and a half tearing themselves apart, while the steppe peoples practiced the arts of war. But before that catastrophe, one more great prince would rule in Kiev. One more man would try to restore order, to reunite the fragments, to make Rus whole again. His success would be temporary, his vision incomplete. But for a moment, it would seem as if the golden age might return. The last unifier, Vladimir Monomakh, was born in 1053 AD, son of Vsevolod Yaroslavich and a Byzantine princess, grandson of both Yaroslav the Wise and Constantine Monomachos, emperor of Byzantium. His very name proclaimed his dual heritage, Vladimir, in the Slavic tradition, Monomach from his Greek ancestry, embodying the synthesis of cultures that Kievan Rus represented at its best. He grew to manhood during the worst years of princely feuding, watching his father struggle to maintain position, observing how ambition and betrayal destroyed cooperation. The experience shaped him. Unlike many princes of his generation, Monomach understood that the division of Rus served only Rus enemies. that princes who hired Cumans to fight their cousins were destroying the civilization they claimed to lead. In 1093 AD, he called a conference of princes at Lübeck, attempting to broker peace. The assembled princes agreed to a principle: let each hold his own patrimony. Instead of the rotation system, each princely line would keep permanent control of specific territories. The agreement recognized reality, abandoned Yaroslav's failed system, tried to create stability through recognized boundaries rather than constant rotation. The Lübeck Agreement did not end conflict, but it reduced it. Princes still fought, but less frequently, with clearer causes, over comprehensible stakes. Some stability returned, trade recovered somewhat, building projects resumed. The relief was palpable in the sources, which describe the years after Lübeck with less despair than the decades before. Monomac himself ruled Pereyaslav, the dangerous frontier principality, facing constant Cuman pressure. He fought more battles against the steppe nomads than any other prince of his generation, conducting dozens of campaigns, winning notable victories, suffering occasional defeats, always returning to fight again. He understood the steppe threat viscerally, had seen villages burned and captives taken, knew what division cost in blood and treasure, he wrote, which was unusual for a prince. A text called the Instruction survives, ostensibly addressed to his sons, but clearly intended for broader circulation. In it, Monomac describes his life, his campaigns, his philosophy of rulership. He advocates for Christian virtue, for justice to the weak, for mercy tempered with strength. He recounts his battles in matter-of-fact detail, listing campaigns like an accountant recording debits. In war, do not be lazy, he wrote. Do not rely on your commanders. Keep watch yourself. Do not fall asleep until you have posted sentries. When travelling through dangerous country, let no man ride ahead of the supplies and weapons. For who can know when he might need a spear or a blade? The text reveals a practical man, pious but not otherworldly, literate but not primarily scholarly, experienced and somewhat weary, but still committed to duty. He describes his hunts as well as his battles, recounting how he bound wild horses with his own hands, how the buffalo tossed him and his horse, how the stag gored him, how the elk trampled him. Even his recreational violence carried risk. In 1113 AD, the death of his cousin Sviatopolk left Kiev vacant. Under the old rotation system, Monomac had the strongest claim, but he hesitated, knowing his accession might trigger opposition. The people of Kiev made the choice for him, sending delegation after delegation, demanding he come to rule them. Finally, he agreed, travelling to Kiev at age 60, an old man by medieval standards, taking power not through force, but through acclamation. His reign as Prince of Kiev, from 1113 to 1125 AD, marked a brief return to something approaching Yaroslav's golden age. He rebuilt churches, patronized learning, maintained order, fought off Cuman invasions successfully. He married his children strategically, creating alliances. He established his authority over the other princes, not through threats, but through respect and superior force of personality. One symbol of his reign persisted long after: the cap of Monomac, supposedly sent to him by his Byzantine grandfather, a crown of gold and precious stones that became the symbol of Rus rulership. Whether the cap actually came from Constantine Monomachos is doubtful. The story is probably legend, but the object itself was real, used in princely consecrations for centuries, now preserved in the Kremlin armory, a physical connection to Rus' past. Monomac's great achievement was showing that unity was possible, that strength came from cooperation rather than division. During his reign, Cuman raids decreased because he coordinated defensive efforts across principalities, organized joint campaigns, punished tribes that broke treaties. Trade flourished because merchants could rely on safe passage. Culture revived because resources went to churches and monasteries rather than endless warfare, but it could not last. Monomac was personally impressive, politically skilled, militarily accomplished, morally respected. His authority rested on those qualities. What happened when he died? Who could replace him? His son, Mstislav, inherited Kiev and ruled effectively until 1132 AD, maintaining his father's system. But Mstislav's death triggered renewed chaos. The generation after Monomakh lacked his authority, his vision, his ability to command respect across princely lines. Moreover, the structural problems remained. Kiev was declining economically as trade routes shifted. The city still had symbolic importance but less practical wealth. Regional principalities had grown strong enough to be effectively independent. Princes increasingly ignored Kiev's authority, pursuing their own interests, making their own alliances. Most crucially, the external environment was changing in ways Rus could not control. The Cumans remained a threat, but they were not the most dangerous force on the steppe. Further east, in Mongolia, a people were uniting under new leadership, developing military systems that would revolutionize warfare, building an empire that would eventually stretch from Korea to Hungary. The Mongols were coming, and when they arrived, divided Rus would face annihilation. But that was still a century in the future, when Monomakh died in 1125 AD. For the moment, his death simply marked the end of an era, the closing of the last chapter in which unified Rus seemed possible. After him came fragmentation, regional powers, competing principalities that shared language and religion, but little else. The dream of Rus unity died with Monomakh, would not be fulfilled for more than 3 centuries. And when it did revive, it would be under very different circumstances in very different lands, cities of princes. By the 12th century AD, the land of Rus had become a geographic expression more than a political reality. The principalities that acknowledged Rus' identity operated as independent states, each pursuing its own interests, occasionally cooperating but more often competing. Understanding this fragmentation requires understanding the major regional centers that emerged from Kiev's declining authority. Novgorod was unique, a merchant republic in a world of princes. Located in the northwest, controlling the trade routes from the Baltic to the interior, Novgorod grew wealthy through commerce rather than agriculture. Its governing assembly, the Veshe, consisted of major merchants and landowners who invited princes to serve as military commanders, but retained real power themselves. If a prince displeased them, they expelled him and invited another. This gave Novgorod stability through institutions rather than personality, continuity regardless of who occupied the nominal throne. Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast represented the future, though no one yet recognized it. Forests and distance protected it from Cuman raids. The Volga and its tributaries provided trade routes eastward. Settlers, fleeing southern violence, brought population and skills. By the 12th century AD, Vladimir Suzdal was building magnificent white stone churches, distinctive architecture that rivaled Kiev's splendor. Princes there accumulated power quietly, exploiting their security to build wealth and military capacity. Galicia, Volhynia, in the southwest occupied dangerous territory between Rus, Poland, and Hungary. But precisely this position created opportunities. Its princes played larger powers against each other, sometimes allied with Poland, sometimes with Hungary, maintaining independence through diplomatic agility. The region had salt mines, valuable resources that funded princely ambitions. It also had contact with Western Christianity, creating cultural mixture that made it distinct from other Rus lands. Chernigov and Pereyaslavl in the south-central region remained important, but increasingly overshadowed. Chernigov had once been Kiev's rival, now it was simply another principality. Pereyaslavl, exposed to constant Cuman pressure, gradually depopulated as people fled north to safer territories. The steppe frontier was claiming lands that had once been productive, reducing the agricultural base that sustained southern Rus power. Polotsk in the northwest had its own dynasty, not descended from Yaroslav, maintaining quasi-independence for generations. It participated in Rus politics when advantageous, ignored Rus affairs when not, pursuing its own path with minimal reference to Kiev's theoretical authority. These regional centers developed their own cultural characteristics. Novgorod's icon painting became distinct, favoring bold colors and simplified forms. Vladimir Suzdal's architecture emphasized vertical lines and decorative stone carving. Galicia-Volhynia showed Western European influences in its art and politics. Regional identities were forming, not yet separate nations, but no longer simply variants of one Rus culture. The fragmentation was not entirely negative. Multiple centers of power meant multiple patrons for churches, manuscripts, and learning. Regional diversity encouraged cultural experimentation. Economic specialization developed as different principalities focused on their comparative advantages, but the political costs were severe. Divided Rus could not coordinate defense, could not present unified front to external threats, could not maintain the international prestige that Yaroslav had achieved. Kiev itself remained important symbolically. It was still the mother of Rus cities, still housed Saint Sophia and the Church of the Tithes, still was where Vladimir had baptized the Rus. Princes fought to control it, not because it made them wealthy or powerful, but because it made them legitimate. The title, Prince of Kiev, still carried weight, but increasingly it was honorific rather than substantive. Real power lay elsewhere, in the regional capitals that had eclipsed their parent city, the cloud in the east. In the spring of the year 1223 AD, strange news reached the Rus principalities from the steppe. Travelers brought rumors of a new power in the east of warriors, unlike any the steppe had known before, of armies that moved with impossible coordination and fought with terrifying discipline. The Cumans, those fierce riders who had raided Rus territories for more than a century, were fleeing westward in panic, begging for alliance against an enemy they could not defeat. The Rus princes were skeptical. The Cumans had been enemies for generations, had burned villages and taken captives, had served as mercenaries in Rus civil wars. Why should they be believed now? Why should ancient enemies suddenly become allies? But the Cuman Khans were desperate, and desperation has its own credibility. They spoke of an army from the Far East, led by generals serving a man called Genghis Khan, though that name meant nothing yet to Rus ears. They spoke of cities destroyed utterly, populations slaughtered, resistance crushed with mechanical efficiency. Mstislav, the bold, Prince of Galicia, listened to these pleas and made a decision. He called for a coalition of Rus princes to join with the Cumans and meet this eastern threat before it reached Rus territories. The response was mixed. Some princes joined, seeing opportunity for glory or plunder. Others refused, skeptical of the threat or unwilling to help Cumans. The coalition that eventually assembled was substantial but not united. Princes who barely trusted each other and certainly did not trust their Cuman allies. They marched east into the steppe, beyond the normal Rus frontiers, into lands where few of them had ever ventured. The army was large by Rus standards, perhaps tens of thousands of warriors, a formidable force that had defeated Cumans and Pechenegs before. The princes were confident, experienced in steppe warfare, certain that their combination of Rus heavy cavalry and Cuman horse archers could defeat any enemy. They met the Mongols at the Kalka River on the last day of May, 1223 AD. The battle was catastrophic. The Mongol commanders, Jebe and Subutai, veterans of campaigns across Asia, employed tactics the Rus had never encountered. The Mongols feigned retreat, drawing the Rus forces out of formation, then wheeled and counterattacked with coordinated cavalry charges from multiple directions. The Cumans broke first, fleeing in panic, their flight disrupting the Rus formations. The Rus tried to rally, to form defensive positions, but the Mongol discipline and coordination overwhelmed courage and individual skill. Prince after prince fell. Mstislav the Bold held out for 3 days on a hill, surrounded but defiant, until he was promised safe conduct if he surrendered. He and his men laid down their arms. The Mongols built a wooden platform over the captured princes and celebrated their victory with a feast atop it, crushing the Rus nobility slowly beneath the weight of the platform and the dancing warriors above. It was not merely defeat, it was humiliation, a deliberate statement about Rus weakness and Mongol power. The survivors staggered back to Rus territories with horrifying tales. 9 out of 10 men had died. Dozens of princes and boyars were gone. The army that had marched east with confidence returned as scattered fugitives. But rather than seeing this as a warning, Rather than preparing for future invasion, the Rus princes largely dismissed it as an anomaly. The Mongols withdrew eastward after Khalkha, disappearing back into the steppe. Surely, the princes reasoned, they had simply been unlucky, had made tactical errors, had trusted the Cumans too much. Surely there was no need for panic, no need for urgent defensive preparations. This was a mistake that would cost them everything. For 14 years, the Mongols did not return. The disaster at Khalkha faded in memory, became a story of bad luck rather than harbinger of doom. The princes continued their feuds, their competitions, their civil conflicts. Kiev changed hands several times. Regional principalities pursued their own interests. Life continued much as before, because humans have remarkable capacity to ignore warnings they find inconvenient. But in the east, beyond Rus' sight, the Mongol Empire was consolidating, organizing, preparing. Genghis Khan died in 1227 AD, but his sons and grandsons continued his work, building an administrative structure to support conquest, developing siege technologies to overcome fortifications, training armies to move across continents. The steppe peoples who had once fought each other now fought under one banner, united by Mongol discipline and terror. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, received authority over the western regions. His mission was to conquer everything west, to the last sea, to bring the Mongol peace to Europe, whether Europe wanted it or not. He gathered armies, stockpiled supplies, recruited engineers and artisans who understood siege warfare, and in the winter of 1237 AD, when the rivers froze and became highways for cavalry, when the forests offered no protection because leaves had fallen and visibility was clear, Batu Khan turned his armies toward Rus. The cloud in the east was about to become a whirlwind of fire. The winter of fire, they came when the rivers were frozen, when ordinary military campaigns suspended for winter cold. They came precisely because winter made movement easier, because frozen rivers became highways for horses pulling siege equipment, because leafless forests offered no cover to defenders. They came with a coordination and scale that Rus had never imagined possible. The first blow fell on Ryazan in December 1237 AD. Batu Khan sent envoys demanding submission and tribute, 1/10 of everything including people. Prince Yuri of Ryazan refused, calling on neighbouring princes for aid. Some sent small detachments, too little and too late. The Mongols surrounded the city, brought up siege engines, and began the assault. Ryazan's wooden walls burned. The city had stood for generations, had weathered Cumans' raids and princely wars, but it could not withstand what came now. The Mongol siege technology, learned from Chinese and Central Asian conquests, made Rus fortifications obsolete. Catapults hurled burning materials over walls. Battering rams broke gates. Assault towers allowed attackers to reach the top of walls, bypassing the need to scale them under fire. When the walls fell, the slaughter began. The Mongol approach to resistance was systematic and terrifying. Make examples so complete that other cities would surrender rather than fight. Ryazan's population was massacred. The sources speak of rivers of blood, of bodies piled in the streets, of churches burned with people inside seeking sanctuary. Prince Yuri died defending his city, along with his family and retainers. Within days, Ryazan ceased to exist as a functioning city, reduced to charred ruins and corpses. News of Ryazan's fate spread terror through northeastern Rus. Prince Yuri of Vladimir, the most powerful prince in the region, attempted to organize defense, but the Mongols moved faster than messengers could ride. Appearing before cities could prepare adequate defenses, they divided into multiple columns, besieging several cities simultaneously, preventing coordinated Rus resistance. Kolomna fell in January 1238 AD. The defenders fought bravely, killing one of Batu's relatives in the battle, but courage without adequate numbers or fortifications achieved only death. Moscow, then a minor settlement, burned after brief resistance. The Mongols moved north toward Vladimir itself, the great city of white stone churches, the repository of treasures and relics, pride of the northeastern Rus. Vladimir's defences were better than Ryazan's. Stone walls instead of wood, larger garrison, more time to prepare. But Mongol siegecraft was relentless and professional. They had engineers who understood angles and leverage, who could calculate precisely where walls were weakest, who could construct siege equipment with frightening efficiency. They had discipline that allowed complex maneuvers, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, sustained pressure without panic or dissolution. Prince Yuri fled Vladimir before the siege tightened, hoping to gather forces from outlying territories. The defense fell to his sons and remaining boyars. They held for 5 days. The Mongols built ramps over the frozen moat, brought siege towers to the walls, kept up continuous assault day and night. On the 7th of February, 1238 AD, the walls were breached. The great cathedral, where the population had sought refuge, was burned. The white stone cracked in the intense heat. Icons painted with such care, manuscripts copied by patient scribes, vestments woven of silk and gold thread, relics brought from Byzantium and Jerusalem, all consumed by flames. The city that had rivaled Kiev in splendor died in a single day. Prince Yuri, gathering forces near the Sit River, learned of Vladimir's fall and tried to retreat. The Mongols pursued, catching his army in the forest. The battle was brief and one-sided. Yuri died, along with the last organized resistance in northeastern Rus. The region lay open, defenseless, at Mongol mercy. City after city fell through the spring of 1238 AD. Suzdal, ancient and holy, burned. Rostov surrendered and survived, but paid crushing tribute. Yaroslav fought and was destroyed. Tver resisted and was erased. The smaller towns and villages fell without even being recorded, their names lost along with their populations. Some cities held out through extraordinary resistance. Kozelsk, a small fortress, refused to surrender. The defenders fought for 7 weeks, inflicting heavy casualties on the besiegers. When the Mongols finally breached the walls, they killed everyone, not leaving a single person alive to remember. They called Kozelsk the evil city and left it a mass grave beneath charred timbers. Novgorod was spared, not through resistance but through spring thaw. The Mongols advanced to within 60 miles of the city, then turned back as the roads became impassable mud. Whether this was planned withdrawal or forced by circumstances, the result was the same. Novgorod survived, its treasures intact, its population alive, preserved by weather where weapons had failed. The campaign of 1237–38 AD destroyed the northeastern Rus principalities utterly. Tens of thousands dead, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Cities that had stood for centuries reduced to ruins. The complex society of churches and schools, markets and workshops, princes and merchants, collapsed into subsistence survival. The Mongols withdrew to the steppe for the summer, but everyone knew they would return. And return they did in 1239 and 40 AD, turning their attention to the southern principalities, to Chernigov and Pereyaslav, to the smaller towns along the Dnieper, and finally, inevitably, to Kiev itself, the mother of Rus cities, the place where Vladimir had baptized his people, where Yaroslav had built Saint Sophia, where 200 years of Rus history had unfolded. The city that had begun this story now faced its ending. The last dawn. You stand on Kiev's ancient walls in the cold of late November, 1240 AD, and you can see them. The Mongol army spreads across the landscape like a dark flood. Tents and horses and siege engines, thousands upon thousands of warriors who have already destroyed every city that dared resist them. You have heard the stories from refugees, the tales of Ryazan and Vladimir, the horror of what happens when walls fall. You know what is coming. The dawn light catches on the Dnieper below, the great river that has sustained Kiev for more than 3 centuries, the highway that brought Viking warriors and Byzantine merchants, that connected these wooden hills to distant seas and empires. The water flows as it always has, indifferent to human catastrophe, eternal in its motion toward the Black Sea. You watch it and remember better days. Days when ships crowded the docks, when the river brought wealth instead of invaders. Behind you, the city clings to its hills. Saint Sophia rises above everything else, its dome still golden in the morning light, the cathedral that Yaroslav built to celebrate victory over the Pechenegs. How long ago that seems now. How innocent those old conflicts. The Pechenegs were raiders, dangerous but comprehensible. The Mongols are something else, a force of nature made military, an empire that spans continents, bringing its weight against this one city on its western frontier. You smell smoke from cooking fires, from forges working desperately to produce more arrows and spear points, from the churches where priests burn incense and pray for deliverance that will not come. The scent of fear is there too, subtle but pervasive. The sweat of people who know they are trapped, who understand that flight is impossible and surrender means slavery or death. The cold bites at your face and hands. Winter is coming, the season when ordinary armies would cease campaigning, would retreat to winter quarters and wait for spring. But the Mongols are not ordinary. They prefer winter, use frozen rivers as highways, exploit the season that should protect cities. The cold that makes you shiver is their ally, freezing the moat, hardening the ground, making their siege engines easier to position. You hear voices behind you, defenders discussing positions, officers giving orders, priests offering blessings. Prince Danilo of Galicia has fled west, unable or unwilling to defend the city. The defense is led by Voivode Demeter, a capable commander but one who knows the odds. He walks the walls daily, inspecting defenses, encouraging the men, maintaining the pretense that resistance is possible. But you see it in his eyes, the knowledge that courage and determination cannot overcome the mathematics of siege warfare when the besiegers have infinite patience and overwhelming numbers. A child cries somewhere in the city behind you, quickly hushed by anxious parents. How many children are in Kiev? How many will see next year's spring? The question sits heavy in your mind, impossible to answer, unbearable to contemplate. You have children too, sent away weeks ago to relatives in distant towns, hoping those towns might be overlooked, that somehow your family might survive even if you do not. The Mongol camp is stirring. You watch them beginning their day, orderly and efficient, cooking breakfast, tending horses, preparing weapons. They do not seem hurried or anxious. They have done this many times before, perfected siege warfare into a system, a process with known steps and predictable outcomes. For them, Kiev is simply the next city, another target on Batu Khan's path to the last sea. You see the siege engines, massive constructions of timber and rope, catapults that can hurl stones the size of a man, battering rams mounted on wheeled platforms. They have been building these for days, assembling them just out of arrow range, Chinese and Central Asian engineers supervising Mongol warriors who follow instructions precisely. The technology gap is obvious. Kiev has bows and spears, courage and walls. The Mongols have engineering and discipline, siegecraft, refined by conquering civilizations across Asia. The sun climbs higher, pale and cold in the winter sky. You think about this being your last dawn, the last morning you will see the Dnieper flowing, the last time you will smell Kiev's air or hear its sounds. The thought should terrify you, but instead you feel a strange calm, almost acceptance. Death has been approaching for months, creeping closer with each fallen city, each wave of refugees. Now it is here, visible and certain, and there is something almost peaceful in the ending of uncertainty. A bell rings from St. Sophia, calling the faithful to prayer. You cross yourself automatically, the gesture learned in childhood, repeated so many times it requires no thought. The bells have rung in Kiev for more than 200 years, marking the hours and holy days, calling people to worship, celebrating weddings and mourning deaths. How many more times will they ring? A dozen? 100? Surely not thousands. You look one more time at the river, at the hills, at the golden domes catching morning light. You try to memorize it, to fix this image in your mind, so that if there is an afterlife, if the priests are right about paradise, you will remember this place, this city where you lived your life, where your grandparents and great-grandparents lived before you. Kiev the beautiful, Kiev the holy, Kiev the mother of Rus cities. The mother is dying, and you, her child, will die with her. But the river will flow on. Silence over the mother of cities. The siege lasted 9 days. The Mongols began their assault on the 19th of November, 1240 AD, concentrating their attack on the Polish Gate, the weakest section of Kiev's defences. Catapults hurled stones continuously, day and night, pounding the same section of wall until the stones cracked and crumbled. Voivode Dimitar tried to organise repairs during the brief pauses, but each wave of bombardment undid the desperate work of the defenders. On the 28th of November, the walls broke. The Mongols poured through the breach, and the slaughter began. Dimitar and the remaining defenders retreated to the Church of the Tithes, Vladimir's great stone church, the first Christian building in all of Rus. They fortified it as best they could, hoping the thick walls might hold where wooden walls had failed. The weight of refugees crowding inside, seeking sanctuary, was too much for the ancient structure. The roof collapsed, crushing hundreds beneath stone and timber. Dimitar himself was wounded and captured, the last defender of the last free city. Then came the systematic destruction. The Mongols burned what would burn, demolished what would not. Houses and workshops, churches and palaces, markets and streets, all torn down or consumed by flames. St. Sophia survived, its stone walls too massive to demolish easily, but it was stripped of treasures, its mosaics damaged, its books scattered or burned. The Church of the Tithes, already partially collapsed, was thoroughly wrecked, its walls pulled down, its foundations exposed. The population was slaughtered or enslaved. The sources cannot give precise numbers, but archaeology speaks clearly. Excavations reveal mass graves, layers of ash and charred bone, evidence of violence on a scale that depopulated the city almost entirely. Kiev, which may have housed 40,000 or 50,000 people in Yaroslav's time, was reduced to perhaps a few thousand survivors, those deemed valuable enough to spare as slaves or skilled craftsmen. The silence afterward was profound. For more than 3 centuries, Kiev had been a city of voices, of market haggling and church bells, of children playing and merchants arguing, of all the sounds that cities make when they are alive. Now those sounds were gone, replaced by wind whistling through ruined walls, by the caw of carrion birds, by the rustle of weeds growing in streets where people had walked for generations. A traveller named Giovanni da Piandelcarpine, a Franciscan friar journeying to the Mongol capital on papal business, passed through Kiev in 1246 AD, 6 years after its destruction. His account survives, a rare Western European description of the city's condition. He counted fewer than 200 houses still standing. He saw countless human skulls and bones scattered across the ground. He found the city essentially empty, its grandeur reduced to ghostly ruins, its streets haunted by memories. The great commercial city was dead. The river route that had sustained Kiev for 3 centuries continued to flow, but now empty of traffic. The merchants who had thronged its waters, lying in mass graves, or sold in distant slave markets. The trade that had made Kiev rich and powerful flowed elsewhere now, seeking routes through safer territories, bypassing the devastated heartland. Archaeological work in modern Kiev reveals the extent of destruction. Excavators find 12th century layers of habitation, evidence of prosperous urban life, houses and workshops, artifacts of daily existence. Then comes a layer of ash and burning, violent termination of normal life. Above that, for decades afterward, almost nothing. The city did not recover quickly, did not rebuild within a generation. The wound was too deep, the population too depleted, the economic foundation too thoroughly destroyed. Some churches survived as physical structures, their stone walls standing when everything wooden had burned. But they stood empty, or nearly so, monuments to a vanished world. The mosaics in St. Sophia still depicted Christ and the Virgin, still showed the same scenes they had shown in Yaroslav's time, but now they gazed down on silence and ruin, on a city that had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Kiev would eventually revive, would be rebuilt under Lithuanian and later Polish rule, would regain some measure of importance. But it would never again be what it was in the 11th century AD, never again the golden city on the Dnieper, never again the capital of a great and unified Rus civilization. that Kiev died in November 1240 AD, crushed beneath Mongol siege engines, and no amount of later reconstruction could resurrect it. The mother of Rus cities lay in ruins, mourned by no one because almost no one remained to mourn. The river flowed past devastated banks. The wind moved through empty streets. Somewhere in the wreckage, a bell might still hang in a damaged church tower, silent now, never to ring again for liturgy or celebration. The golden age was over. The dream of Rus unity was finished. A new era had begun, darker and harsher, and it would last for more than 2 centuries. But endings are also beginnings. The seeds of what would come next were already planted, growing in unexpected places, in principalities that had survived, in populations that had escaped, in memories that could not be entirely erased. The seeds that survived. The Mongol conquest of Rus was comprehensive but not complete. Geography and timing preserved some territories, allowed some threads of continuity, even as the center collapsed. These survivors would carry Rus civilization forward, transforming and adapting it, ensuring that destruction was not quite the end of the story. Novgorod was never conquered. The Mongols approached in 1238 AD, but withdrew before reaching the city. Whether Batu Khan intended to return later, or simply calculated that conquering the marshy northwestern territories was not worth the effort, Novgorod survived intact. Its churches still stood, its people still lived, its merchants still traded along Baltic routes. The republic that had long been semi-autonomous now became effectively independent, acknowledging nominal Mongol overlordship, but paying tribute without suffering occupation. Under Mongol suzerainty, Novgorod actually prospered. It joined the Hanseatic League, the commercial confederation of northern European cities, trading furs and forest products for manufactured goods from the west. Its unique political system, the Merchant Republic governed by assembly, continued functioning. Its icon painters developed a distinctive style, bold and colourful, that became famous throughout the Orthodox world. Culture flourished precisely because Novgorod was spared the violence that destroyed Kiev. In the northeast, Vladimir and Suzdal lay in ruins, but they rebuilt under Mongol rule. The princes who survived became tax collectors for the Mongol Khans, gathering tribute from their devastated territories, sending it south to Sarai, on the lower Volga, where Batu established his capital. This collaboration was humiliating but pragmatic. The Mongols demanded submission and tribute, but otherwise allowed local governance. Princes who paid reliably and kept order were left in peace. Those who rebelled were crushed. Over time, one principality in this devastated region began to dominate Moscow. In 1240 AD, Moscow was barely worth mentioning, a minor fortress settlement that burned with barely a notice in the chronicles, but its princes were shrewd collaborators, reliable tax collectors, patient accumulators of power. They convinced the Mongols to grant them authority over neighbouring principalities. They attracted the Orthodox metropolitan, the senior church official, to reside in Moscow rather than ruined Kiev. Slowly, over generations, Moscow grew from village to town to city to regional power. Galicia, Volhynia, in the southwest, avoided the worst devastation. Prince Danlo, who had fled Kiev before its fall, maintained his western territories and even expanded into neighbouring regions. He negotiated carefully with both Mongols and Western European powers, playing them against each other, preserving his autonomy through diplomatic skill. For several decades, Galicia-Volhynia remained a powerful independent state, continuing something of the old Rus political tradition. But Galicia-Volhynia's independence could not last. The Mongols tolerated it only as long as tribute flowed and rebellion did not occur. Western powers, particularly Poland and Hungary, pressured from the other direction. When Danlo's line died out in the early 14th century AD, the principality fragmented and was eventually absorbed by Lithuania and Poland. The southwestern Ruslands would develop differently from the northeastern, increasingly influenced by Catholic Europe, increasingly distant from their Orthodox roots. Lithuania itself became inheritor of Western Rus territories. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, ruled by pagan Lithuanian nobles, expanded southward and eastward into formerly Rus lands. They conquered Polotsk and Minsk, Smolensk, and eventually Kiev itself. But Lithuanian rule was light, and the conquered territories retained their Rus character, their Orthodox faith, their Slavic language. Lithuania became a strange hybrid, Lithuanian in dynasty, but Rus in culture. Pagan rulers over Orthodox subjects, gradually merging the two traditions until Lithuania itself converted to Christianity. The Orthodox Church provided continuity across political fragmentation. Monasteries survived in Novgorod and Vladimir, in Galicia and Lithuania. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving texts from the pre-Mongol era. Churches maintained liturgy in Slavonic, keeping language and religious tradition alive, even when political unity had vanished. The metropolitan moved from Kiev to Vladimir, and eventually to Moscow, following power but maintaining institutional continuity. Cultural memory survived in chronicles and epics, in oral traditions and family memories. People remembered, sometimes accurately and sometimes not, the golden age before the Mongols. They remembered Yaroslav the Wise, Vladimir the Baptizer, the glory of Kiev when it rivaled Constantinople. These memories, embellished and mythologized but containing kernels of truth, sustained identity even when political reality was fragmented and subordinate. The Rus territories, under Mongol rule, often called the Golden Horde's domains, developed differently from regions that escaped conquest. 2 centuries of Mongol overlordship left deep marks on administration, military organization, taxation systems. Russian princes learned Mongol methods, adopted Mongol efficiency, absorbed Mongol ruthlessness. When Moscow eventually overthrew Mongol rule in the late 15th century AD, it did so by becoming in some ways more effectively authoritarian than the Mongols themselves. Galicia, Volhynia, and the territories absorbed by Lithuania developed differently, more influenced by Poland and Catholic Europe. The seeds planted by Vladimir's choice of orthodoxy over Catholicism, by Yaroslav's alliances with Byzantium rather than Rome, by 3 centuries of looking east more than west, were partially undone in these western regions. They remained Orthodox mostly, but with Catholic influences, Latin elements, Western European political ideas. These different development paths would eventually create the 3 modern nations that claim Kievan Rus as ancestor: Russia in the northeast, Ukraine in the center and southwest, Belarus in the northwest, same root, different branches, growing in different soils under different conditions. 3 heirs to 1 cradle. In the 21st century AD, nearly 800 years after Kiev's fall, 3 independent nations trace their heritage to Kievan Rus: Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Each claim to be the true inheritor, each has legitimate historical connections, each has shaped the shared past to support present identity. Understanding these competing claims requires recognizing that history is not simple, that civilizations do not have single descendants. Russia's claim flows through Moscow and Vladimir Suzdal. When Moscow overthrew Mongol rule and began expanding, its princes claimed to be gathering the Rus lands, reuniting territories that had been artificially divided by conquest. The religious authority of the Orthodox Church, centered in Moscow after Kiev's fall, supported this narrative. Russian historians emphasized continuity, from Vladimir to Yaroslav, to the princes of Vladimir, to the Tsars of Moscow, to modern Russia. Ukraine's claim is geographic and cultural. Kiev itself, the mother of Rus cities, stands on Ukrainian soil. The baptism of Rus occurred in the Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine. Yaroslav the Wise ruled from Kiev, built St. Sophia in Kiev, created the Golden Age in Kiev. Ukrainian historians emphasize that Rus began in their land, that Moscow was a frontier outpost, while Kiev was already a great city, that Ukrainian people are the direct descendants of the original Rus populations. Belarus claims heritage through Polotsk and the northwestern territories, through the lands that became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Belarusian historians note that their territories maintained Rus culture and orthodoxy even under Lithuanian rule, that they represent a distinct branch of Rus development, neither Russian nor Ukrainian, but separately descended from the common Kievan root. All three claims contain truth. All three also contain selective memory and convenient omissions. The reality is that Kievan Rus was diverse, that different regions developed different characteristics. Even during the unified period, that division created genuinely separate paths of development that cannot be collapsed back into single identity. Modern politics makes dispassionate historical analysis difficult. When Russia and Ukraine are in conflict, when Belarus faces questions about independence and identity, the past becomes a weapon in present battles. Each side marshals historians and archaeologists to prove their interpretation, to demonstrate their unique legitimacy, to deny their rivals' claims. For our purposes, in this quiet exploration of the past, we can acknowledge all three connections without choosing between them. Kievan Rus was real. Its transformation into multiple successor states was also real. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all genuinely descended from that common civilization. All carry pieces of its legacy, all have the right to remember and honor their specific paths from shared origins. The Rus heritage is not zero-sum. Ukraine claiming Vladimir does not rob Russia of historical connection to him. Russia claiming Yaroslav does not erase his rule from Ukrainian history. Belarus remembering Polotsk does not diminish either of the others. Multiple legitimate heirs can inherit from one ancestor. The reality is messy and complex, resistant to clean nationalist narratives, but more interesting for that complexity. What matters for us, here at the end of this journey, is recognizing that the seeds planted by Vladimir, cultivated by Yaroslav, scattered by Mongol conquest, did grow. They produced different fruits in different soils, but all trace back to those 9th century warriors and merchants on the Dnieper, to that unlikely synthesis of Norse and Slav and Byzantine, to that moment when pagan princes chose Orthodox Christianity and set their civilization on a specific path. The arguments about inheritance will continue, will probably never be fully resolved, but the river still flows. St. Sophia still stands, damaged and rebuilt but recognizably itself. The languages spoken in Moscow, Kiev, and Minsk are related, descended from the Old East Slavic that Yaroslav's scribes wrote. The churches still follow Byzantine liturgy in Slavonic translation. The connections persist despite political fragmentation, despite centuries of separate development, despite modern national boundaries and conflicts. 3 heirs to one cradle, 3 branches from one root, 3 rivers flowing from one source. All are true, all matter, all carry forward something of what began on the Dnieper more than 1,000 years ago. Whispers of the Dnieper. The river flows as it always has, patient and eternal, indifferent to human glory and human sorrow. The waters that carried Viking longships and Byzantine merchants, that witnessed Vladimir's baptism and reflected Yaroslav's golden domes, still move southward toward the Black Sea, still follow channels carved over millennia, still connect forest to sea as they did in the 9th century AD. Stand on the banks now, in our modern time, and listen. The water whispers of what it has seen. Cities rise and fall, empires bloom and wither, but the river remains, constant in its flowing, carrying memory in its current. St. Sophia stands yet in Kiev, though the city around it has changed beyond recognition. The mosaics that awed visitors in Yaroslav's time still gaze down from their golden backgrounds, Christ Pantocrator still blessing from the dome, the Virgin still interceding with outstretched arms. 11 centuries have passed since Byzantine craftsmen set those tiny coloured stones in place. And still they shine, still they speak of beauty and eternity, still they connect present to past through unbroken line of vision. The Orthodox liturgy continues in churches across the lands that were once Rus. The same prayers in Slavonic, the same rhythms and chants, the same incense and candles, the same theological vision that Vladimir adopted in 988 AD. The words have not changed, the melodies persist. A worshipper in modern Moscow or Kiev or Minsk hears sounds that Yaroslav would recognize, participates in rituals that have continued unbroken for more than 1,000 years. Languages evolved from Old East Slavic carry forward the speech of the Dnieper Valley. Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian are siblings, related through common descent from the tongue that scribes wrote in Yaroslav's time. A word spoken in Kiev today might differ only slightly from how that same word sounded when Monomach spoke it. The river of language flows too, changing gradually, but maintaining recognizable course. In museums, artifacts wait behind glass. Byzantine silks and Scandinavian brooches, Arab coins and Rus metalwork, fragments of the material culture that archaeological excavation has recovered from the earth. Each object is a connection, a physical bridge between centuries, proof that the past was real, that people lived and worked and created beauty in times so distant they seem almost mythical. The names persist. Vladimir and Yaroslav, Novgorod and Kiev. These words still carry weight, still evoke memory and meaning. Parents still name children after princes dead for 9 centuries. Cities still bear names given a millennium ago. The sounds themselves are inheritance, passed down through generations who often forgot their significance but preserved them nonetheless. In quiet moments, in churches and museums, by riversides and in old cities, the past speaks softly. Not loudly, not demanding attention, but there if you listen, the whispers tell of ambition and achievement, of glory and catastrophe, of humans building and destroying, creating and losing, hoping and despairing. They tell the story we have followed tonight, from rivers of trade, to golden domes, to Mongol fires, to fragmented inheritance. The Rus civilization that began with Rurik and Oleg, that flowered under Vladimir and Yaroslav, that fragmented after Monomach and fell to the Mongols, is gone. It cannot be resurrected, cannot be restored, cannot be made whole again, but it is not entirely lost either. Pieces survive, transformed but recognizable, scattered but still somehow connected to their source. The river knows, the river remembers, the river flows on, carrying in its waters all the years and all the lives, all the prayers and battles, all the loves and losses that have occurred along its banks. It flows past ruined walls and rebuilt cities, past battlefields grown peaceful and markets once again bustling. It flows from the forests of Belarus, through the heart of Ukraine to the Black Sea, connecting geography across time, binding past to present, through liquid continuity. Listen to the water, listen to the whispers, listen to the quiet persistence of memory across centuries of change. The Kievan Rus is gone, but the river flows on, and in that flowing, something of the past remains, carried forward into whatever future awaits. Sleep now, let the river carry you. Let the gentle turning of history's wheel rock you toward rest. The past is finished, the present moment passes, but the eternal flow continues, peaceful and inevitable, toward distant seas and distant dawns. I'm grateful we could travel these ancient paths together tonight. The Kievan Rus rose from river trade and Viking ambition, bloomed into Orthodox splendor under wise princes, then fragmented and fell to conquests from the east. But its legacy persists in languages and liturgies, in nations and memories, in every church bell that rings across the lands that were once Rus. The civilization transformed rather than ended, scattered rather than vanished, living on in the 3 nations that claim descent from that common root. Tonight we have walked the Dnieper trade route, stood with Vladimir in the baptismal waters, marvelled at Yaroslav's golden age, witnessed fragmentation and catastrophe, and found seeds of continuity even in destruction. The story is finished, but not closed, because history flows forward like the river itself, carrying the past into futures unknown. Sleep peacefully, wandering through history's quiet gardens.